Okay, well, we're here today to talk about dementia, all kinds of dementia. Not just dementia in the clinician's office, but the whole global aspect of dementia, especially with respect to the community itself. So, what if we could do it better? And that's what our nonprofit set out to solve and do a few years ago. What if, instead of just asking what's the diagnosis, what if any drugs to use, what if we asked why? Why does this patient in front of me have dementia? What were the risk factors that led to that? And of those risk factors, those that are remediable, those that we could fix, what if we fix those and see what happens? So that's kind of the premise of what we're doing here today, what Dr. Bredesen teaches. And we hope that this will be informative. It'll be what we need to hear as a community. My name is Pat Zook. Good morning. Welcome to the beautiful Paramount Theater here in central Minnesota, St. Cloud. We're in between thunderstorms, so we're hoping that electricity holds here. And we finally got all our Zoom passwords straightened out, so this is stuff they didn't teach us in medical school. But I want to thank several people. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, Dr. Chris Tackle, who will be one of our panelists who will ask your questions on your behalf to Dr. Bredesen. Dr. Tackle led our St. Cloud Medical Group for years. He's also vice president of our nonprofit, on our board, and a great runner. To his right, to our left, Dr. Kim Jaden, Minnesota 2019 Family Physician of the Year. And also got a master's degree. Also got a master's degree in public health. Danny Protovinsky couldn't be here in person today with scheduling issues, but she is online. We're going to ask that the online questions be sent to the chat box. Dr. Jaden will field those. The questions from in-house, if you write them on your cards, pass them to the sides of the aisle, and the ushers will pick them up and bring them up. Dr. Tackle will be handling those. So our last hour will be just answering questions. Dr. Bredesen will answer questions that you have submitted. We've included the ones that you've already submitted when you registered. So they will be included in the questions. And we won't be able to get to them all, obviously. But if you do write your question, if you're brave enough to put your name and a phone number, I will try to call you and get you answers even well after this presentation. So, also I would like to thank several people who helped get this together. Steve Brunsberg, who of the St. Paul Neighborhood Network, helping us with technical things. The Paramount, Gretchen Boca and her staff has been very helpful. We have several people who supported us. These are some of our supporters, but I want to put out a couple of disclaimers right away. Number one, we can't be your doctor and we won't be giving medical advice. Don't construe anything that's said here today as medical advice. If you're going to change or do anything with the medications or whatever of your loved ones or yourself, always consult your own doctor, provider, clinician before you do that. Second part, if we can go back to the support people screen, that would be good. These people support us in one way or another. Dr. Dale Bredesen is donating his time today, which is a tremendous benefit. He's very busy and very popular. Centricare has donated office space for us in the Minnesota building. You'll see that in the video in a little bit. We really appreciate that. And Dr. Ken Holman, we've been on Zoom and met with him several times, and he's very supportive of what we're doing. Whitney Senior Center is run by the City of St. Cloud, and Paula Wojcicki is the director. She actually got us started seeing clients there April 12th a year ago. And we saw patients there. There's Paula right there. we moved into our new office at the Minnesota building in September 1st of 2021. Minnesota Council on Central Minnesota Council on Aging has also been a partner. I don't see their logo up there, but in programs and presentations and so forth. And Minnesota Board on Aging, I'd like to single them out as a special support for our mission. They like what we do, what we're doing for our clients. We've seen several clients at our Dementia Resource Center. But in no way should that be construed to imply that they agree with any of the products, services, protocols that will be discussed today. I want to make that perfectly clear. So their support for our mission, their support for the good things we do is different and does not imply that they support any particular protocol, product, medication, or any of those things. So I think we got that legal thing out of the way. When you apply for continuing medical education credits, there's very strict criteria. We have to follow that. So I think we have about 30 people getting continuing education credits for today, and it's approved for up to 3 hours. I did want to go to the goals, so if we could go to the goals screen. I took this picture. It's on the front of the St. Paul Science Museum when I was at the Meeting of the Minds presentation. I think it was 2017 or 18. And I took this from the rivers, or from the convention center. This was on front of the Science Museum across the street. This little kid is looking to the skies, and he's dreaming big. And that's what we ask you to keep an open mind today, to be curious, and to be accepting of some new information. Now if we could go to the goals. So these are our main goals. I think one of the main things we want to emphasize is the importance of early identification. If you identify memory problems or similar cognitive problems, but don't do anything about it, it doesn't do much good. There's been a lot of emphasis about early identification, but then nobody does anything. They say, well, come back in a year. Well, that's when we get all excited, when there's lots you can do. So early identification, and that implies that we need to get through the denial barrier that we see. When we first start feeling a little trouble with our memory, we don't want to admit it. We go into denial, and that could delay doing some things about your risk factors that we do. That could delay that for 2 or 3 or more years. And so early detection and getting past the denial. And that may be something you can do for your loved one who's having symptoms. Talk them through that. Try to get them past the denial. We need to convince primary care clinicians of all types to do more dementia care. My colleagues who are neurologists say there's no way they can see all the dementia patients that there are. And so we get quite a few of our referrals from nurse practitioners, physician assistants, social workers, and others. But we need to get primary care clinicians doing full-scale dementia. Our goal is to collaborate with them, to help them, to do a lot of the work, the groundwork that's very important for dementia care. Just getting the diagnosis, getting whether you need drugs or not is not enough. We need to do more. We don't mean to change what's being done. We mean to add to it and be collaborative in that. And so what we want to do is leave you with a sense of hope. Not false hope, but hope that there's lots you can do. Minnesotans don't like it when you say there's nothing we can do, come back in a year. We want to do stuff. So whatever we can do for mom or dad, let's do it and give it a try. So those are our goals for today, and hopefully we'll achieve those. We hope that we have information. We have almost 150 people who identified themselves as either people with symptoms or worried about symptoms. So we hope we have information for you. We hope we have information for clinicians. It's important and interesting. We hope we have information important and interesting for the dementia service providers. Paula is one of them. There are many people who help older adults dealing with dementia. So we'd like to tell you a little bit about our nonprofit. Our nonprofit is officially called the Central Minnesota Dementia Community Action Network. We're an official 501c3 corporation, incorporated officially in December of 2019. We work at what we call the Dementia Resource Center in the Minnesota building. And Steve, if you could fire up the projector for our DCAN video. Let's do that.
Central Minnesota Dementia Community Action Network, known to many as DCAN, is conveniently located in the northeast intersection of Minnesota Highway 15 and 12th Street in the city of St. Cloud, Minnesota. DCAN and its Dementia Resource Center, or DRC, welcomes anyone for evaluation who is experiencing or whose lives are affected by dementia, or those who have questions about dementia, early detection and prevention, and improving their quality of life. This includes dementia patients, partners, their loved ones, family members, and caregivers. Our mission at DCAN is to improve access to quality dementia care throughout our central Minnesota community. Here we are at the DCAN Dementia Resource Center, Suite 103, off the ground floor lobby of the south entrance of the Minnesota building. Let's go in and meet the staff and see what they're up to today. Here's the DRC staff greeting us at the door just like they do for client appointments. Hello to Executive Director Patrick O'Rourke, Care Navigator, Educator Tammy Kolbinger, and DCAN President and Founder Dr. Pat Zook. Medical Director Dr. Chris Tackle was too busy working during this video, but he's here on the Summit panel. Wave, Dr. Tackle. Here is our DCAN mission statement poster, flanked by photos of our DRC care team and staff, and our great board of directors we are blessed with. Let's have a look around. Looks like our Executive Director, Patrick O'Rourke, is hard at work in his office. Hello, Patrick. Here is Dr. Zook in his exam room, finishing some reports and getting ready for his next patient. Hi, Dr. Zook. DCAN and the DRC staff are especially thankful to Centricare and other St. Cloud businesses for their generous in-kind support of this office and for most of this equipment, furniture, and much of our office supplies. Let's go see the rest of the office. Here's another exam room for when we're really busy. Oh, and here's our DRC Care Navigator, Tammy Kolbinger, talking to a client and working on a Facebook post. Hello, Tammy. I hear she's the one who really keeps this place humming. These are not real patients, as DCAN and the DRC strictly comply with HIPAA standards for privacy and security of patient information. Although a referral is not required and all are welcome, we often get referrals, typically from primary care clinicians, and then do a thorough intake and assessment, about 90 minutes with Tammy, complete an extensive review of the patient's medical history, usually done online, and then schedule an in-depth evaluation where the medical team meets with the patient and their care partners, which often includes the patient's partner, loved ones, family members, and other caregivers for an in-depth evaluation, about 2 to 3 hours. Then we create a comprehensive care plan, often 6 to 7 pages of findings and recommendations that we share with the patient's primary care clinician and caregivers. The DRC team does most of their evaluations in this bigger room, since more than one caregiver often comes in with their loved one for their visit, and we feel blessed to have this space and big table for more room to keep everyone comfortable. Thank you, model clients. Here is the DRC classroom where Tammy's support groups meet. Also, Dr. Steve Hoover has his guided autobiography classes here. They're a noisy bunch, so they usually close the doors. The DCAN staff also does community outreach and education throughout greater central Minnesota and facilitates caregiver support groups here at the DRC and in Becker, Minnesota at the Becker Community Center. We also work closely with the City of St. Cloud's Whitney Senior Center, where DCAN got its start. Here's the break room with more donated equipment for breaks or a quick lunch together, depending upon what's going on for any given day. We also offer our patients, clients, care team, and visitors a cup of coffee, tea, or water while visiting, taking a class, doing an intake, getting their medical evaluation, or during one of their quarterly follow-up visits or medical updates. Well, that's our DRC home base. Thanks for taking the tour with us today. Contact us anytime to schedule a personal tour, ask any questions about dementia, or to discuss volunteer opportunities. Visit us on our website at dcan-mn.org or check us out on Facebook or LinkedIn. You can also call us at 320-640-6726. Our special thanks again to Dr. Ken Holman and CentraCare, and also to the Minnesota Board on Aging Dementia Grant Committee for their generous support of our mission to improve access to quality dementia care throughout our central Minnesota community.
So just so you know, those are my friends. They're not patients, okay? They were brave enough to be in the movie, and none of us is actors. So they were volunteers as well. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Bredesen soon, but before I have a video to show for that, Kim wanted me to mention to those of you online that the questions and answers will be the very last hour, and they will be live. And our panelists will ask Dr. Bredesen your questions on your behalf. That will be the last hour. That satisfy the concern? So they're not able to chat. So Ruben, if you're able to enable chat for our online community, that would be pretty important. Okay. All right. So maybe we could, I met Dr. Bredesen online only. We've done a couple of Zooms. He's an incredible presenter and teacher. He's won teaching awards, and you'll see why in a minute. But we do have a video. So Steve, if you could fire up the projector.
Dr. Dale Bredesen received his MD degree and did his medical residency at Duke University Medical Center from 1977 to 1980. Dr. Bredesen served as resident and neurology chief resident at University of California, San Francisco until 1983, and then as clinical instructor in neurology at UCSF until 1987. He served for 3+ years as an NIH postdoctoral fellow at the UCSF laboratory of Nobel laureate Dr. S.B. Prusner in neurodegenerative disease. Having held positions as professor of neurology and director of the Easton Center for Alzheimer's Research at UCLA, and as director of the Alzheimer's Disease Program and director of neurodegenerative disease research at UCLA's Geffen School of Medicine, Dr. Bredesen served in faculty research and teaching positions at UCSF and UCLA in the departments of neurology. He held the Elizabeth R. and Thomas E. Plott Chair at UCLA's Center on Aging, and as professor, scientific director, founding resident CEO from 1999 to 2013 at the Buck Institute for Age Research, where he has continued as professor emeritus since 2017. He is currently a professor in UCLA's Department of Molecular and Medical Pharmacology, as well as serving as Chief Science Officer, Brain Health at Apollo Health in Burlingame, California, where they are merging medicine and technology to prevent and reverse cognitive decline. Dr. Bredesen has served as principal investigator or co-principal investigator on over 45 research grants and fellowships totaling in excess of $50 million, amongst which includes recent research in Alzheimer's, ApoE transcriptional effects, and ApoE in Alzheimer's. He has presented well over 300 lectures and presentations, including lectures in Alzheimer's disease pathogenesis, the role of cell death signaling in Alzheimer's disease, prionic loops, antiprions, and dependence receptors mediating neurodegeneration, and system therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. Dr. Bredesen has authored and or co-authored over 225 peer-reviewed publications, including in leading academic journals such as Science, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy. He has authored or co-authored several academic textbooks and over 30 chapters. Dr. Bredesen is also author of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling books, The End of Alzheimer's, and his 2021 book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, How Patients Recovered Life and Hope in Their Own Words.
You'll recognize the voice of Bob Hughes of KNSI Radio, who did our voiceovers. We're very thankful for that. Also, not that I know the difference between chat and Q&A, but for you online folks, please enter your questions under Q&A instead of the chat. Did I get it right this time? Okay. All right. So we have now the opportunity to introduce Dr. Bredesen, who will have about a 50-minute talk. Please, it may generate more questions. Just submit them so that we can pick up your index card questions in the house and a Q&A for those of you online. He'll talk for 50 minutes. We'll have a very short break of 5 minutes, enough for you to get to the bathroom or the coffee service and back. But we're going to keep talking during that break. He'll then go into another 50-minute presentation, at the end of which we'll have a longer break of about 20 minutes. But during that time, we'll roll a couple of videos that are quite outstanding. So it'll be nonstop from here on in. And then after we have that 20-minute break where we show the videos, we'll have our final hour of questions and answers. Our panelists will ask Dr. Bredesen your questions live. So, Dr. Bredesen, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me all right?
We're all ready to go. Take charge.
All right. Thanks very much. Thanks very much to Patrick, and thanks to Dr. Zook for the kind invitation. I hope everyone can see the screen here with the slides. And let me just start out by saying that what I'm going to present today came out of our laboratory research for the last 30 years, where we asked the fundamental question: how does neurodegeneration occur? What actually drives the molecular processes of neurodegeneration? And that led us to an idea, a protocol that we've used successfully, but this is not yet the standard of care. We hope that it will be someday. We are in the middle of trials, and I'll show you some very exciting results from our first trial in just a few minutes here. So I'm a consultant for Apollo Health and Life Seasons. I will not be talking about any of their products or related things today. But let me go back to this notion that what is typically done with Alzheimer's is that people are told there's nothing that can be done except take a drug that doesn't work very well. And so our research suggested something quite different, as Dr. Zook mentioned. So what's called, quote, success in Alzheimer's is a semantic issue. So here, for example, if you take, just as an example, someone who has mild cognitive impairment, which is a pre-Alzheimer's condition, or has Alzheimer's disease, then on average, this has been published repeatedly, on average, they lose about 3.5 points on a 30-point scale per year. This is MoCA or the MMSE, for example. This is with no treatment. Here is the drug that was approved last June, aducanumab. In the best situation, one dose in one trial, it slowed the decline by 22%. It didn't make people better. It didn't stabilize them, but it slowed the decline by 22%. And in contrast, the trial that I'll show you today is one where we actually saw improvement, and we've actually now had people on the protocol for 10 years. So they are continuing their improvement. So we're trying to go after what actually causes the cognitive decline. So in the first talk here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. Why do we do what we do? What has the research suggested? Then in the second one, I'll talk about how we do it, what we actually do to people. And we've trained over 2,000 physicians in 10 different countries and all over the United States. So you can easily get training in this area or go to one of these physicians. As what was mentioned earlier, this is not medical advice. This is research and what we're doing with our patients, but it's not meant to be medical advice for anybody. So here's the problem. There we go. So the current standard of care, if you go into a center of excellence or a center today and with cognitive decline, and you happen to have pre-Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's, what you'll be told is that there's some cause. We don't know what the cause is, the implication being that there's a cause of Alzheimer's disease, that it's one disease, it's what we call Alzheimer's, and that there's a treatment. We'll write a prescription for Aricept or Namenda, depending on what phase, and it's one phase. You're not going to change You're going to do one thing, continue, and then it's going to be ineffective. It's really a barbaric, unfortunately, situation when it comes to dementia. As many people know, the area of neurodegenerative disease is the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. As they say, everyone knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. So we've got a number of them now, and there's a book out now about this. So if you look at the research, it does not match up with what is being done in the clinic. So the research findings show that there are many different contributors. There's not a single cause of Alzheimer's. Instead, there are many different things that contribute to what this process is. And we'll talk about what this is, the fundamental nature of this problem. And therefore, no surprise, there are subtypes. You can have a more inflammatory type of Alzheimer's. You can have a more toxic type or a more atrophic type. So there are different subtypes of this problem. And therefore, there are many personalized programs. Instead of just writing a prescription for one thing, the same thing for each person that doesn't work, the idea is you want to determine what's actually driving the problem. Now, for perspective, of course, COVID-19 has now killed over 1 million Americans. And unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease, of the currently living Americans, young and old, it will lead statistically to the death of about 45 million of us. So it actually dwarfs the pandemic, unfortunately. And here's the big problem. The pandemic, we know this is due to a virus. We have sequence of the virus, we have variants, they have Delta, we have Omicron, we have the new Omicron variants. So we understand the fundamental nature of this problem as a viral illness. And in contrast, with Alzheimer's, no one understands the fundamental nature of the problem. It's not just a virus. It's not just a metabolic disease. It's something else. And that's what's needed. We need a model that is consistent with the fact that there have been over 150,000 papers published on this one disease. But none of these various models has led to success. We need to have something that accurately predicts success and failure, and that drives us in the right direction to know what to do about this problem. But before I get into that, I want to just put a plug out there to be very careful about this term mild cognitive impairment, because it really has, unfortunately, led people to feel that things are okay. It's mild. And so we talk about mild cognitive impairment. Don't worry, you have MCI. It's not Alzheimer's. Go home, come back in a year, that sort of thing. The problem is that MCI is a relatively late stage of the disease. It's like telling someone, don't worry, you only have mildly metastatic cancer. Unfortunately, it is a relatively late stage of dementia pathophysiology. Therefore, we really want to get people before they get to MCI to get the best results. So you go through 4 phases when you develop Alzheimer's disease. In the first phase, you're asymptomatic. You can already see changes, though, on spinal fluid exams and PET scans. And this has been well documented and published by numerous groups. The second phase is now where it's called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. You know there's something wrong. Often your spouse will know that there's something wrong, but you're still able to score normally on these cognitive tests. So the thing is that this may last 10 years, and that's what the epidemiologists have shown. So these first 2 phases, that's when we want to get things. We want to get anyone who's 45 years of age or older to be evaluated and get on active prevention. If they begin to develop symptoms, we want to treat during this first phase, or phase 2 here, where they have SCI. And as I mentioned, this is cognitive symptoms without abnormal cognitive testing. So as you can see, it depends to some extent on what tests you use, how sensitive they are. Now, the third of 4 phases, so a relatively late stage of this underlying problem, is what we call mild cognitive impairment. That means you now have abnormal cognitive testing, but you still are able to do your activities of daily living. 5 to 10% of these people each year will convert to full dementia. And that's the final phase, phase 4, where you're activities of daily living are affected. And so as you can see, it takes a long time to go from the beginning changes all the way to the point of developing dementia. And the studies, again, have shown about 20 years from the initial changes that can be picked up on spinal fluid or PET scan to get all the way to the point of a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So we really have a tremendous window of opportunity if we can convince people to get on prevention or earliest treatment. And this is why when someone has late stage disease, it's so important to have the sons and daughters get evaluated, get on active prevention so that you can end this problem with the current generation. So there's a fundamental problem that we face, which all of us have been trained in medicine, face, where if you're looking at the disease, Alzheimer's disease, it is fundamentally different than the types of illnesses we have been trained in medical school to deal with. So if you look at simple illnesses, and these were the things that were common problems in the 20th century, then here's the way they look. And a good example, pneumococcal pneumonia. We do pretty well as physicians with pneumococcal pneumonia. Now, if you have alcohol on board, for example, you have increased risk for a poorer outcome from pneumococcal pneumonia. If you have diabetes mellitus, if your B cells aren't working very well, for example, you have multiple myeloma or something like that. And there are many other factors as well. But the pneumococcus itself here, the strep pneumoniae, is so much more important than any one of these other things that we as physicians have gotten away with over the years, just writing a prescription for penicillin, amoxicillin, cephalosporins, et cetera, because we can just treat that one thing. That's good enough for a good outcome in the vast majority of cases. The problem is that that's the way we've been taught to do medicine, to write prescriptions. And unfortunately, the illnesses that are killing virtually all of us today, which are complex chronic illnesses, cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, chronic renal failure, type 2 diabetes, those things, these are complex chronic illnesses. And if we take Alzheimer's as an example, your risk for it is associated with many factors. So here, insulin resistance, various pathogens. And by the way, around 80 million Americans have insulin resistance. Most don't know it, but it is a risk factor for cognitive decline. NF-kappa B here, anything that is associated with inflammation. Mercury and other toxic metals, mycotoxins, organic toxins, homocysteine, which is associated with reduced methylation. And there are numerous others. We'll go into some of these in a few minutes. But the point that you can see here is that none of these things is like the pneumococcus, where it's so much more important than everything else that we as physicians can simply write a prescription for it. That is the problem. And therefore, the idea of trying to have a single drug that cures all people with Alzheimer's has unfortunately eluded us to date. And there have been over 400 failed clinical trials. Now at a total cost for development and trials over $40 billion without a real success. So as I say, this is the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. Here are just some of the relatively recent examples. And as an example here, this semigacistat, which came from Lilly a few years ago and failed, spent over $500 million developing that one. Not only did it not make Alzheimer's better, it actually makes it worse. So there's some problem, some failure to understand the problem when we have the best minds and all sorts of wonderful research and development not leading to answers, and in fact, leading to things that actually make you worse. So there are many theories from amyloid to tau to prions to type 3 diabetes, and you can just go down the list here. Unfortunately, none of these theories has ever led to a really successful treatment for this illness. And so we've been interested for years in our basic research at what drives the problem. Can we look under the hood? Can we understand what is the problem here? And will that give us a better idea of what to do about it? So I want to just take a minute or two here and talk about the background. What came out of the research? What can we see when we look at this process? So here's a diagram. This is actually here the membrane of a neuron. So you've got about 100 billion neurons in your brain. And then you also have supportive cells that are called glial cells. And in your neurons, you've got on average about 10,000 connections. So you have between 500 trillion and 1 quadrillion synapses. You really have a remarkable computer inside your skull. So this is now from one neuron, and we're going to look at one protein, and this is called APP, amyloid precursor protein. This is the thing that gives rise to the amyloid that you see in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. And this is a normal protein. And in fact, it's quite a remarkable protein. And what we found over the years is that this thing functions as a switch. And so you can imagine this being the president of your country. So this is like the president of my Brainistan. Okay, now this thing, when things are good, this thing is actually cut at a single site by molecular scissors that are called proteases. And so what happens when things are good, it's cut at a single site. It produces two. So it's like the president sending out two memos. One you can see here is for outside the cell. This is called SAPP alpha. The other one is for inside the cell, and this is called alpha CTF, or C-terminal fragment. And what they're telling your cells is that things are good, you can grow, you can maintain connections, and you can make new connections, good connections, etc. And by the way, this is analogous to what happened to our country in COVID, where we were told in early 2020 to shelter in place, socially distance, don't go to work, do more Zoom meetings, all these sorts of things. So what happened? We went into a recession. That's exactly what's going on in your brain when it recognizes various insults. When things are not good, then it goes into a protective downsizing mode. So here you can see here, it's cut at 3 different sites, and therefore it causes the production of 4 of these little peptides, pieces of protein called SAPP beta, A beta. So there's the one that's the amyloid related one. This is the one that the drug companies are trying to get rid of and that we as neurologists have vilified over the years. But as you can see, it's part of a much bigger story. And it's actually responding to insults. And we'll talk about what insults it responds to. This is actually a protective downsizing signaling group, including this amyloid. And then there's one called JCASP and C31. So these are now saying things are not good. You've been invaded by bacteria or viruses or toxins or other causes that inflammation related things, or your metabolism is not doing well. You may be developing type 2 diabetes, things like that. And therefore, we have to go from a growth mode into a protective downsizing mode. Again, much like what happened to our country with COVID-19. So we must look for what's causing the problem. What are these various insults? And most people, we find anywhere from 10 to 25. We've not found a single one in anybody yet. And this is thousands of people looking through. So it's typically multiple things that contribute, and then we need to address those things. But when we do that, we get better outcomes than previously. So as we were doing this research years ago, we started to realize that these chronic illnesses are essentially signaling imbalances. So for example, many people know about osteoporosis. What happens is you have cells, and here's an example of one here, which are called osteoblasts. They make bone. And then you have cells here that are called osteoclasts. You can see that they're multinucleated cells, and they're the ones that are picking up the bone. And so there's a dynamic process, laying down, picking up. It's just like working on your house all the time. You're fixing a little here, you're taking a little there, you're making a new room here. That's how your bone stays healthy and strong. As we get a little older, unfortunately, from numerous things, hormonal changes, nutritional changes, et cetera, we can enter a situation in which the osteoblastic activity is chronically exceeded by the osteoclastic activity. This would be just like if you had two construction teams that worked on your house, one that did the demolition and one that did the construction. And imagine that for years, the one that did the demolition always did a little extra. They're your friends, they're going to give you a little extra. The ones that did the construction never showed up. Then after a while, your home would start getting smaller and smaller. And this is the same thing that happens with osteoporosis. Cancer, same idea, but in this case, you have a set of genes that will cause you, called oncogenes, that make more cells, cytoblastic, and then you have a set that turns this off, that actually causes your cell to commit suicide, and these are called tumor suppressor genes. And so when you have an imbalance, too much activity, too little suppression, in fact, we get what's called cancer. And the same thing we found in the lab for Alzheimer's disease. There's a whole set of things that are synaptoblastic and a whole set of things that are synaptoclastic. These are working together to get memories, to make memories, to store memories, to enhance memories. And on the other hand, to pull back when things need to be protected. So what that means here is that your probability of developing Alzheimer's disease is proportional to the integral over time. In other words, over time, what's happening is you have a whole set of things that cause this synaptoclastic signaling pulling back. You have the whole set of things that are causing synaptoblastic signaling. If you're on the wrong side for years, you ultimately can develop Alzheimer's disease. Now, that doesn't tell you what test to order. The good news is it's approximately equal to what happens with 4 different major groups. Anything that causes ongoing inflammation, infections, leaky gut, chronic sinusitis, poor dentition, on and on. Anything that causes toxicity, and that's 3 major things. That is inorganics, things like air pollution, mercury, things like that. Organics, things like formaldehyde and glyphosate and toluene and benzene and things like that. And then biotoxins, things that are actually made by organisms, for example, mycotoxins. And then here in the denominator, energetics. If you don't have enough energy, and that is cerebral blood flow, what's flowing to your brain, the oxygenation, mitochondrial function, and then ketones to burn. You need to be able to burn ketones in your brain and also glucose. So the problem is that we all need to be able to burn those 2 things, glucose and ketones. Ketones come from fat. And so what happens is, as we get a little older, many of us lose the ability for both. We're not able to burn glucose because we have insulin resistance, which is associated with a diet that's high in simple carbohydrates, again, very, very common in the US and the Western world. Unfortunately, when you get that, because you now have a higher insulin, that prevents you from making the ketones. So you literally have an energy failure in your brain as you begin to get a little older. And we then want to restore both the insulin sensitivity and the ability to make and burn ketones. And then the last of the 4 big groups is trophic support. And that means growth factors, nerve growth factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, things like that, hormones, and nutrients, things like vitamin D. And again, you can trace in our research, you can trace the pathways from these molecules. For example, estradiol binds to the estrogen receptor, enters the nucleus of the cell, turns on hundreds of genes, and among those are the ones that take that APP that I showed you in the good direction to make and store new synapses. So these things are all critical. Now, what this means is we spent years in the lab trying to develop a drug for Alzheimer's, and actually had one that went to trial in Australia a number of years ago, but we realized that it couldn't do enough different things to make a difference. So the problem is here, if you were to develop a perfect Alzheimer's drug, this is what it would have to do. And you can see that's a very tall order for a single little molecule, these little drug molecules really can't do all these different things. So we really need to look to see what is needed. So what we tell the patients is, imagine you have a roof with 36 holes in it. And this is because when we looked at this, we looked initially at the different mechanisms. There were 36 of them. We now know that there are a few more. There are somewhere around 45 or so. But the good news is it's not thousands, it's dozens. But it's not one. There are dozens of things that can contribute to this problem. And therefore, to get the best outcome and the best prevention, we need to identify those, and then we need to address those. But when we do that, we get unprecedented improvements. So as I mentioned, there are multiple types, and here's what they are. So type 1 is inflammatory, and this can be from infections or leaky gut or autoimmune diseases, things like that. And this is kind of your typical 65-year-old person who's got inflammation going on, and you can easily see that on various laboratory studies. There's a different kind of person, and these people are often in their kind of mid-70s, and they have reduced trophic support, often reduced hormones, reduced nutrients, and things like that. And they tend to look very different. And by the way, when we defined these, we thought we'd hit on something new. And then we discovered that the Ayurvedic physicians said the same thing several thousand years ago. So we were just a little bit too late on that one. But we came to very similar conclusions, by the way, to what these physicians had seen thousands of years ago. Then the third one is glycotoxic. And the reason we call this type 1.5 instead of type 3 is because it has features of both type 1 and type 2. So when you have chronically high insulin, chronically high sugar, then you have two different processes that occur. On the one hand, you have non-enzymatic glycation. What that means is simply that the glucose molecules stick on to lots of different proteins, just like remoras on a shark. And so those proteins now don't work as well, and they don't look the same. And so they can create inflammation. Your body can recognize them as foreign because they are now different. So that gives you the type 1 Alzheimer's inflammatory features of it. On the other hand, you also have had a chronically high insulin, and so now you have some insulin resistance, and therefore insulin doesn't work. Insulin is a remarkably good trophic factor for your brain. And so you're now also losing that ability as well. Okay, so you get some of both there. Okay, there we go. So type 3 is toxic, inorganics, organics, and biotoxins. Type 4 is vascular, and then often with some degree of vascular or mixed dementia. And then finally, traumatic. When you have trauma to your head, one of the early responses is the production of this amyloid that is associated pathologically with Alzheimer's. So we really need to train a new kind of physician. The classical Chinese physicians understood a lot about how the body works, but they didn't have any idea about DNA, RNA, large data sets, computation, any of that stuff. The modern physicians, very good with DNA and RNA and things like that, but they tend to focus in one area rather than looking at the whole systems approach. So we need to train a new kind of physician that understands both of these things. So let me just show you some examples here. A couple of people who've done very well. Here's one of the first people back from end of 2013, just dramatic improvements here. And this is a fairly classical story with someone who had the most common genetic risk factor, which is ApoE4. We'll get into that. Virtually everyone should know the status of their ApoE, although we're often told don't bother to check because there's nothing you can do about it. And I have to say we disagree with that because there's a tremendous amount, and there's even a wonderful website called apoe4.info that looks at and has over 3,000 people who are all ApoE4 positive. So here's another person, just increases dramatic improvements in cognition and even improvements in her hippocampal volume. Here's another person, improvements in his gray matter volume in his brain. So just to finish up with this last few minutes on how does this work? What is this disease? And then the second part, we'll talk about, okay, so what can we do about it and what are we doing about it? So this tells us a little bit about the most common genetic risk factors. Now there are 30 some genes, and actually just another couple dozen that reported recently that have some relationship with Alzheimer's in terms of giving you risk. But 95% of Alzheimer's is sporadic. In other words, you don't have a single mutation that says this, you are going to get this. So the vast majority of us, it's a sporadic illness. However, about 2/3 of people who have Alzheimer's have a risk factor gene. It's just like having a risk factor for high cholesterol, same idea. And this is called ApoE, apolipoprotein E. And this is a little protein that carries lipids. So it's a little bit like your butcher. It's the guy that carries the fat, one of the guys that carries the fat. And it had been known since the 1990s that ApoE4 is associated with an increased risk for Alzheimer's. So about 3/4 of the population has no ApoE4. For example, I checked myself, I'm an ApoE3/3, which is the most common. It's kind of vanilla. Now, if you don't have an ApoE4, your chance of developing Alzheimer's during your lifetime is about 9%. It's not too high, but it's not zero either. On the other hand, if you have a single copy, and that's 75 million Americans, your chance during your lifetime is 30%, which is why we'd like everyone to check and get on active prevention. If you have 2 copies, and that's 7 million Americans, then your chance of developing it well over 50%. Most likely you will develop it during your lifetime. Again, we'd like everyone to find out and get on prevention. We know that at the other end of this is Alzheimer's disease, but what hadn't been known is what's in the middle. How does ApoE4 increase your risk? Now, it had been known that in fact it does increase the amount of amyloid in your brain, but it hadn't been clear why. So this is a fascinating story, and it has to do with evolution. It has to do with longevity versus shortgevity. It has to do with Alzheimer's. Some people have called this the God gene because it has so many remarkable effects. And if you go back to when hominids arose from simians, which is between 5 and 7 million years ago, what happened? It turns out there's not a lot of difference in our DNA. We share over 90% similarity in our DNA. And in fact, as I told my wife, who's an integrative physician years ago, my genome is closer to a male chimp genome than it is to yours as a female human. And she said, well, duh, of course, you like the Three Stooges, so does the chimp. You like ESPN, so does the chimp. So, okay, maybe she was right about that. But the bottom line is we are surprisingly similar in our DNA sequences to simians. But what's interesting is those few changes, and so here's God coming down and touching the simians, and you can see here it's led to something quite different, the hominids. And if you look at the few differences, the surprise is what's overrepresented in those differences is pro-inflammatory genes. And as Professor Tuck Finch has shown from USC, this is how we came down. When we came down out of the trees, we started walking on the savannah, we're puncturing our feet, we're eating meat that is full of pathogens. What helped us was having this pro-inflammatory state. And ApoE4 is not present in a chimp, but was the primordial one in the hominids. And you can see here, ApoE4, here's the original one. And what happens is it looks like the columns on a house. So these columns are next to each other. And this is because this right here, this arginine 61 has a positive charge. And here's glutamate 255, which has a negative charge. So it holds this thing nicely together. Now, what happened is after 96% of our evolution as hominids, ApoE3 appeared only 220,000 years ago. And now there was another mutation here, cysteine 112, which now interacts with ARG61. And so you can now see this allows you to swing out here so that now this looks more like a nutcracker. So ApoE4 and ApoE3, which is now the dominant, most common one, look quite different. And again, as you can see here, 96% of our evolution, everybody had what we associate with Alzheimer's now. Just in the last 220 years, ApoE3, and then ApoE2 about 80,000 years ago. So to make a long story short, what we found in the lab, and this is all published, is something quite new. ApoE4 interacts with multiple receptors. That had been known, but what we found is that it actually enters the nucleus and interacts at over 1,700 different gene promoters. So what this means is the guy that we've been thinking is your butcher because he carries around the fat is also your senator because he's making the laws of the land. He's actually now changing the way your DNA is read out. And if you look at the different genes that this affects, you could not tell a better story for Alzheimer's. It's related to inflammation. It's related to neurotrophins, as I mentioned before. It's related to, well, what people have talked about for red wine and resveratrol. The reason that people take resveratrol, this molecule here, SIRT1, it unfortunately turns it down. So all of these things contribute to this protective effect. So the bottom line from the research is that as we're getting into now understanding for the first time what the underlying problem is, we can take a completely different approach to prevent it and reverse it. And we believe from the results we have in our trial that I'll show you in a couple of minutes, that just as for things like leprosy and polio, and I think most of us didn't wake up this morning worrying about leprosy or polio, but these were huge scourges in their day. Alzheimer's shall become a former scourge, and it's up to all of us to do the right things to reduce the global burden of dementia, and so to make it so that people don't worry about Alzheimer's disease. It is no longer a scourge. So I'm going to end the first part there. I think we're pretty much on time here. And I know we have a break, and then we'll talk about, okay, what do we do given this understanding of what's causing the problem? There's a tremendous amount you can do about it. In fact, I was taught that there is nothing that will prevent, reverse, or delay Alzheimer's disease. And what we found is literally the opposite of that there are tremendous numbers of things. The armamentarium is huge, and learning to do the right things at the right time, absolutely critical. So we'll talk about that next. Thanks very much.
All right, well, a 5-minute break. Feel free to go out and have coffee service, go to the bathroom. But Dr. Bredesen, if you can stay on the line, maybe I get to ask you a question or two.
Sure.
So we in Western medicine are used to just driving through, sticking out our arm, having something done to us, and off we go.
Yeah.
How do we get people to address all those risk factors simultaneously, or is that the best way to go?
It's a great point. And so you have to remember when we started this and we were starting to look at the first patients, and this was back in 2011, we actually proposed the first comprehensive trial back in 2011, and we were turned down by the IRB that said, you can't do a comprehensive trial, you have to just do one thing. We said, yeah, but this disease isn't just about one thing. So we are trying to make it, now that we understand better and we're getting better results, we're now trying to make it simpler, easier. So I think, we'll get there at some point, but I think we also have to remember this is what 21st century medicine is all about. 20th century medicine is about simple things like pneumococcal pneumonia. HIV, as difficult as it was, it's still just a virus. So we have good antivirals now. But with these complex chronic illnesses, we need to start by getting larger data sets. And I think that will be pretty easy. You get a little blood drawn, and your doctor, instead of looking at a couple of things, will look at a couple thousand things pretty quickly and easily. And then from that, we'll very quickly get an optimal protocol. And so we've developed actually software to do just that, to look at these larger data sets and to generate, first of all, what subtypes do you have? And often it's more than one. And then second, what is an optimal protocol going forward? I think it's going to be harder and harder for a physician without the help of a computer to get all this information and to get all of it. For example, if I gave you, your genome on a piece of paper, and there were 3.3 billion base pairs, you and I couldn't look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is the problem. So computers help us and tell us, this person has methylation issues, this person has some detox issues, they're ApoE4 positive, single copy, so forth and so on. We're going that same direction for all the metabolic changes, the epigenetic changes, the genetic changes. And I think this is the future of medicine. And I do think it will get easier. And I also think that what you pointed out, you'd like to just have a drug. there will be important places to use the drugs, but it's just that when you're patching that one hole, and a drug is a fantastic patch for one hole, you need to remember that there are 35 other ones that need also to be addressed in one way or another. So I think that, this will be the era of working with health coaches. This will be the era of wearables. So, you can look at your Apple Watch and you can get what your heart rate variability is. You can get how is your SpO2. Nocturnal oxygenation is one of the problems that leads to cognitive decline if you've got a hypoxia, which many people have and don't recognize. You can check your blood sugar, you can check your blood pressure, you can check your ketone level, all of these things very easy now. You can check your sleep stages with things like Oura rings. So there are a lot of things we can do that we couldn't do even a few years ago that will help us to make it pretty easy to prevent, and especially in early stages, reverse cognitive decline.
One thing I wanted to ask you, you talked about ApoE4.
Yeah.
And people who have the ApoE4, they're not doomed, are they? They can overcome the expression of that gene.
Absolutely. Not only are they not doomed, virtually no one who has it should get Alzheimer's if they get on the right prevention or earliest reversal, and they don't wait until things are late. So there is a tremendous amount that can be done, and it's easy to get on apoe4.info, which is a nonprofit site that was set up by one of the patients. And by the way, most of the people there are on some version of the protocol that we developed and doing very well. So check out apoe4.info, check out Julie G., who was the founder of apoe4.info and who also is one of the people in the book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. And by the way, she is ApoE44, so she has 2 copies. That's public information. And that she's made available to many people. And so she's on the site, she talks about this, she talks about what she went through, because she did develop symptoms, in her case, in her late 40s. And her husband, who's an airline pilot, would fly to Europe and fly back a week later, and he could notice decline even during the week he was gone. So she was really in some tough situation, and she's done extremely well. And so, we hope that everybody will get themselves checked, get the basics checked, not only their ApoE4, but the basic metabolic profiling, so that you can understand what are my risks. And there's absolutely a tremendous amount that can be done about it. This should be a rare disease. It really should be. Right now, it's, as a professor from UCSF has pointed out, it is the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. It's actually now number 2 in the UK, and among UK women, it's number 1 cause of death. So there's a tremendous amount that can be done, and we can make this a rare illness.
And you did mention ApoE2 briefly, but by the same token, if you have ApoE3 and the ApoE2, you are afforded some relative protection, but you're not guaranteed a free ticket.
That's exactly right. But your risk if you're a 2-3 is even lower than a 3-3. So that is a very protected one. It's relatively uncommon, but it is a protected one. But you're not protected from things like some of the toxins we'll talk about will absolutely impact the 2-3 patients. So yes, you're better off. Your overall risk is lower, but as you indicated, it's not 0, unfortunately.
We have a lot of people living with dementia online today. Several of them have signed up, and they want to hear, I think several of them who are still in denial, maybe haven't gone in to get evaluation. What are some common things I can do to maybe thwart my dementia tendency? What are the top things that I could do, that I could comprehend and easily do on my own to get started, maybe get a jump start?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about some of these things, but it's the basic things we talked about. You want to get yourself to be insulin sensitive, and so simple things to do. And again, if you're having symptoms, you should go beyond the simple things to do. You should go and get evaluated by someone who's been trained. But the simple things you can do a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. As you know, lots of interest in ketogenic diets these days, and in part because they actually have a good impact. There's some beautiful work from Professor Stephen Kinane on ketones and their ability to improve patients with mild cognitive impairment. And he's published this repeatedly. Then the second thing is, as we've heard often, get regular exercise. And there's some new wrinkles on this. Things like HIIT, the high intensity, things like EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy, and what's called KATSU bands. These were actually used by some of the Olympians. These things reduce the blood flow while you're doing the exercise and essentially give you more bang for your buck. And then sleep. Most people don't know their sleep status. They don't know if they're dropping their oxygenation while they're sleeping. So easy to find out. You can get a little oximeter and stick it on your finger. You can borrow one from your doctor. You can get a wearable and things like, Apple Watch is one example, the new Fitbits, for example, any of these things. Or you can have a sleep study, any of these, and they will tell you what is your oxygen doing while you're sleeping. We should be up at the 96 to 98% range of oxygen saturation while we're sleeping. We have a lot of people who are dropping down into the 80s, even into the 70s, and that increases risk. And fixing that, which there are numerous ways to do that, CPAP, dental devices, there's a new thing called Vivos, which opens up the airway. So there are all sorts of ways to go after this, but optimizing your SpO2, your saturation of oxygen while you're sleeping, important and relatively easy to do. And then keeping your stress levels down, managing stress. We do well with having some stress and then having it resolve, but chronic stress is something that harms many of us. And so you can you can check your heart rate variability and do some deep breathing and improve your stress. That actually helps. And then some brain training. So you can see each one of these things by itself is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. But when you start changing the overall system by doing all these different things, and there's some targeted supplementation and there's some detoxification and things like that, but those are some of the basics. And again, ultimately it depends on what are your risk factors. Some people it's being driven more by things like sleep apnea. Some people it's being driven more by a leaky gut or by a chronic infection or by exposure to a toxin. So you need to target those things that are driving it for each person.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll get started here in just a minute. I did want to thank you again, Dr. Bredesen, for donation of your time today. This is very enlightening. We're honored that an international and nationally acclaimed expert would spend their early morning with us. You started at 7 o'clock. We started at 9 o'clock because you're in California. We really appreciate that. And I can see why you've won awards for teaching, quite obviously.
So I started at 5:30, not 7, because I had to get ready for this. So yeah, this is you're early on California time here.
Well, we're in between thunderstorms, so we're thankful. Our electricity is still on, so we're glad that you're able to go. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Are you ready to go for presentation number 2?
I think we're all set here. Let me go back and share the screen here again.
And then I remind people, please, those of you online, submit your questions through Q&A instead of chat. Okay, Q&A is the better way to ask your questions.
All right, so I'm going to start talking about some specific patients now, and what actually happens when people come in, and what can we do to analyze what's going on, and then what can we do to help out here. So here's one example. This is a 62-year-old woman who's having trouble with some naming, and that's a common one. And we generally break this down into people who come in with mostly an amnestic syndrome, things that where memory is the big problem, and that's around 2/3 of people, versus the other group that comes in with things that are not so much related to memory, but more related to things like navigation or problems with recognizing faces, calculation, executive function, planning, things like that. because they tend to have different causes. This particular woman was having trouble with naming things, with executive dysfunction and things like that. She turned out to have a single copy of ApoE4. Again, 75 million Americans are in that situation. She had a BMI of 24, which is normal, but you can see her fasting glucose. And one of the important themes here is that we no longer want to think about within normal limits. That's what we physicians use, but all it means is within 2 standard deviations of the mean. It has nothing to do with what is physiologically optimal. So when you have problems with cognition, we want to treat you now like a competitive athlete. We don't want you to be just okay. We want you to be really good. So this person, you can see, had pre-diabetes. So her hemoglobin A1C is already up at 6.1%. Her fasting insulin is a high. And let's see here. Yeah. So, and we want it to be down, down around 4 or so. And hers was too high. You can see here HSCRP. So this is saying that she has some inflammation. We'd like to see your C-reactive protein, which is this high sensitivity CRP, down at about 0.5. She's at 1.7. So she's inflamed. She has some insulin resistance. She has some glycotoxicity. She has a low vitamin D. We'd like to see it higher. And hers is 24. She has some thyroid issues. Her TSH, we'd like to see below 2. She's at 2.4, which isn't horrible. She has virtually no estradiol, and she has a low pregnenolone. So all of these things are contributing to her problem. Pathogen testing negative. She had no herpes family viruses, no tick-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease. So she was seen by Dr. Hathaway, who's one of the doctors who did the trial with us. She was put on a plant-rich ketogenic diet, exercise, stress reduction, probiotics, prebiotics, some omega-3s, which help with this inflammation that she has, vitamin D and K2, methyl B12, and methyl tetrahydrofolate, and she was put on bioidentical hormones to get her hormones optimized. So basically, her metabolism and inflammatory status were optimized. She improved, and typically it takes 3 to 6 months. You have to remember, when we see people, this is, they've been going on for years. And so it takes some time to turn the ship around. And we typically see and tell people, look, give it 6 months after you've done everything right, give it 6 months. She improved over 12 months. Her MoCA score went from 20, which is quite significant MCI. She was right on the borderline of dementia, improved to 28, which is normal. She's able to run her business again. She's done very well, and she's continued to do very well, which is maybe the most important thing. These people, when they improve, as long as they continue to optimize things, they do very, very well. So here are the goals for the treatment based on what we found in the lab, what we want to correct for people. And as Dr. Zook said, yes, it's not yet a simple thing where you just do a drive-through and someone gives you a pill, but the pills can help, but you want to address the things that are actually causing the problem. So we want to start with your energetics. And as I mentioned earlier, that's your blood flow, your oxygenation, your ketones, and your mitochondrial function. We want to make you insulin sensitive. We want to give you a HOMA-IR, which is just a measurement of your insulin sensitivity of 1.0. Most people, it's higher than that. We want to get you trophic support, growth factors, hormones, and nutrients. We want to resolve the inflammation. And most importantly, we want to determine why you're inflamed. We want to treat any pathogens. If you've got Lyme disease, we want to treat that. If you've got poor dentition, P. gingivalis, which is one of the things that invades your gums and gives you periodontitis, is found, guess where? In the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease. The neuropathologists have pointed this out. So we want to make sure that you don't have that cause of inflammation. We want to detoxify if you have onboard toxins, which so many of us do. Then we want to give you some mild stimulation with light. There's magnetic stimulation forms, light, and of course, brain training is another form of stimulation, and it helps to get best outcomes. We want to improve your adaptive immune system and reduce the inflammatory part, the innate system. So as you may know, there are 2 different parts of the immune system. There's the old evolutionary part of the system, which is the general part. This is called the innate system. It doesn't recognize what the pathogen is. It just says we're under attack. We want to have a general prevention of problems. That's the thing that makes the inflammation. And by the way, the amyloid is part of that innate system. So again, there's a parallel between what happened in COVID-19 and what's happened with Alzheimer's disease. With COVID-19, you have the innate system active, so you have a tremendous inflammation, and you don't have the adaptive system, which is getting rid of the virus. And in fact, the coronavirus itself actually has a molecular mechanism that prevents you from responding appropriately, which is why you have this cytokine storm that unfortunately is what kills people with coronavirus. Well, in Alzheimer's, you have the same thing. You have inflammation, but the adaptive system hasn't cleared the problem. So you don't die of cytokine storm in Alzheimer's, you die of cytokine drizzle. It goes on for years and years and years and years in a mild way, and that is what's downsizing your brain. So we want to improve that adaptive system and reduce the inflammation of the innate system. Then after all that, it's fine to start getting rid of the amyloid. But again, remember that the amyloid is a protective, innate immune system related molecule. And so this idea of just doing that and not addressing all of these things that are causing it really makes no sense biologically. And then finally, we want regeneration. And this is where things like stem cells are going to be very important. And there are ongoing trials of stem cells. But unfortunately, they're being used as a monotherapy. And this is a little bit like trying to rebuild a house as it's burning down. You want to stop the flames first and then start rebuilding the house. So I think on the right background, stem cells will turn out to be very important. So how do we achieve these goals? So for energetics, as I mentioned, we want ketosis, we want mitochondrial function, et cetera. And there are lots of ways we can do this. We can do this by giving exogenous ketones. We can do this by using a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. We talked earlier about exercise, sleep, stress reduction. These things are actually important to get your coordinated neural network to function optimally. Cerebral blood flow, this is where things like exercise with oxygen therapy come into effect, and they're so promising. There was a very interesting recent paper out of Israel showing that just improving oxygenation alone, which they were doing with hyperbaric oxygen, but that's not always needed. They were getting some good results with just that. So again, getting appropriate metabolism for your brain is critical. As I mentioned earlier, when we sleep, we should be up at 96 to 98% saturation. If you're down at 85, and we've seen people into the low 70s, you are hurting yourself. And then mitochondrial support, and there are things we can do for that. Ubiquinol, nicotinamide riboside, PQQ is something that actually increases mitochondrial number. So again, the armamentarium is large. For insulin sensitivity, what happens is really interesting and was beautifully documented by Professor Ed Getzel from UC San Francisco a number of years ago. And what happens in your brain when you have insulin resistance because you've had chronically high insulin, which again, about 80 million Americans have this, then a signaling molecule, which is called IRS1, which is inside your cell, changes in its shape. It actually changes where the phosphorylation is on it. And it goes from signaling, which is saying, okay, we've got insulin, let's respond to insulin, which is associated with tyrosine phosphorylation. It flips over to serine threonine phosphorylation. So it's basically now resistant. It's a little bit like, if your son is playing the drums every day and you put on some earmuffs so that you can't hear this, and then your spouse comes in and puts on a beautiful Brahms lullaby, you don't even hear it. That's the problem with insulin resistance. So again, there's an appropriate diet. We call it KetoFlex 12-3, but there are others you can use, but the idea is the same. Get you high fiber, get you appropriate phytonutrients, get you appropriate periods of fasting, appropriate detox, appropriate choline intake, all of these things, which are very helpful. Strength training. Your muscle is very rich in insulin receptors. So when you do strength training, you help your insulin sensitivity. And then again, many options for support from magnesium to zinc. Zinc is critical for the utilization of insulin and the production and secretion of insulin. Some people like chromium picolinate, Ceylon cinnamon, R-lipoic acid. The good news is, again, there's a tremendous amount that can be done here. And then there are some pharmaceuticals. When you have a low insulin production, you can actually enhance that with things like Januvia or Victoza. And then trophic support. There are growth factors such as brain-derived neurotrophic factor and nerve growth factor, all sorts of ways to improve these, starting, by the way, with exercise. Exercise increases your BDNF about 10 to 12% or so. Whole coffee fruit extract increases it about 20% or so, but there are others. Alcar increases nerve growth factor. Hericium erinaceus, which is actually a lion's mane mushroom, increases your nerve growth factor. So there are all sorts of ways to do this. And I think, again, in the future, we're going to see a lot more on intranasal trophic factors because these have access to your brain and can be supportive. Optimal hormones, getting your estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, pregnenolone, thyroid, etc. That is helpful. These support the neural function and neural survival. And then optimal nutrients, and Dr. Paul Clayton from Oxford has pointed out how depleted our soils are often for many of these nutrients. So we have to make sure that we have appropriate levels, optimal levels of vitamin B12, vitamin D, choline, omega-3s, etc. Resolving inflammation. Fairly easy to resolve the inflammation, but what you really want to do is find out what caused it, and you want to address those things as well. So Professor Charles Sirhan from Harvard discovered pro-resolving mediators a number of years ago, and you can actually now take these and help it to resolve the inflammation, and then you can prevent further inflammation with things like omega-3s and curcumin and ginger and other things as well. And then you want to remove the cause. Is it poor dentition? Is it a leaky gut? Is it an infection that's been unrecognized? Is it a lack of sleep that actually associated with inflammation? So I want to show an example of someone who very clearly had type 3, which is the toxic type of Alzheimer's. And she presented initially with depression, which is a common one if you've got the toxic associated Alzheimer's disease, and paraphasic errors, making errors in her speech. She struggled with her computer work, completing a gingerbread man, which she'd done many times before with her grandchildren. She confused clock hands, and she really started worrying when she forgot to pick up her granddaughters. She went in and had an amyloid PET scan that was positive. She's ApoE4 positive. So she was a very typical person presenting with Alzheimer's, in this case, toxin-associated Alzheimer's. She had a MoCA score of 24, so she's already well along into MCI. So she's already in that third phase, mild cognitive impairment. Her hippocampal volume is relatively low at 14th percentile, and the diagnosis of MCI due to Alzheimer's disease was made. She began on a clinical trial for an anti-amyloid drug, and each time she got the injection, she would clearly get worse. Then she would slowly struggle to get almost back to where she had started. So fortunately for her, after 8 treatments, she said, "This is clearly making me worse." And a number of people have noted that. Luckily, she left. Then she was further evaluated. She actually contacted me, and I worked with her physician. She failed her visual contrast sensitivity, which is a classic for someone who has toxin exposure. Her C4A, which should be less than 2830, was 7990. So she has a high problem which is an inflammatory problem associated with biotoxins. TGF beta 1 should be less than 2380, high. MMP9, high. Urinary mycotoxins, high. She has what's called MARCONS, which is multiply antibiotic resistant coag negative staph. And then she has a slightly high HSCRP and a very low triglyceride and low zinc. And we see this frequently, this pattern, with people who have toxin-related Alzheimer's. So she began on the protocol. She did very, very well. Her symptoms resolved. She was once again able to speak, cook, shop, tell time, build gingerbread man, no longer forgot to pick up her granddaughters. Her MOCA came to a perfect 30 where it's remained. She's now 6 years on this program. Her hippocampal volume went up from 14th to 28th percentile. She's been stable, doing very well, and she keeps working at it. So we want to continue to optimize things. Some people, we find new things that come up later. Now, what are features suggestive of this toxin associated? What should kind of alert you, which are the red flags? So if someone has early onset, these people are often young. She actually had her initial exposures and symptoms in her 40s. It's often associated with perimenopause or menopause. These people often have a non-amnestic presentation, often with executive dysfunction and or dyscalculia. She had executive problems. They're often ApoE4 negative. She wasn't. Interestingly, the ones who are ApoE4 positive tend to also have some memory issues, which she did. Whereas the ones who are ApoE4 negative tend to be the more non-amnestic ones. So often they have a negative family history of dementia. It's often accompanied by depression. They often have low zinc, low triglycerides, low glutathione, failure on visual contrast sensitivity, which is something you can do easily online. They often have symptoms of what's called CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but most of them don't have full-on CIRS. These are people who have lung problems and problems with rashes. These are people exposed to mycotoxins. They're often hypersensitive to stress, and that's something to remember, because if these people, fly overnight, go on red eyes, have a lot of stress in their lives, difficulty at work, they really decline rapidly. And then often they'll have some headache or sinusitis, which is another thing to remember. So detoxification from the various things that you identify. There's some basics. Just a high fiber diet turns out to be very helpful. Using filtered water, using a sauna, sweating, non-toxic soaps, increasing your glutathione, sulforaphane, ascorbate, all very basic things we can all do, easy to do. And then targeted detox if you've got specific things. For example, Professor George Brewer up at the University of Michigan, I guess down at the University of Michigan for you guys, up at the University of Michigan for me, developed the Brewer protocol over the years, and it's a good way to reduce especially copper toxicity. And then Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Neil Nathan both have protocols for reducing biotoxins, and they actually even have courses for. So all these things can be addressed. So we can also think about this in 3 simple phases. So phase 1 is just the basic stuff that, again, we should all be doing, getting an appropriate diet, making sure we don't have insulin resistance, exercising, both aerobic and weight, 45 minutes or so, 5 times a week. Think about Katsu bands if you like it, if you have any vascular concerns. Make sure that your sleep is okay. Make sure that your stress is okay. I like to check my heart rate variability. It's an easy thing to do. You can use things like HeartMath to improve that. Some simple brain training with things like Double Decision and Hawkeye. This was the father of brain training was Professor Mike Merznick from UC San Francisco. Done an absolutely fabulous job, brilliant neuroscientist. Developed this years ago, and his is called Brain HQ. You can use other ones. We tend to use that one just because he's published more that actually helps. And then there are all sorts of targeted supplementation based on what is actually the problem. And so there's been a lot of pushback and criticism, supplements aren't a cure for Alzheimer's. Of course they're not. We're not saying that they are, but leaving these things out instead of using everything at our disposal to optimize neurochemistry is just asking for failure. Some basic detox, eating some crucifers, eating your Brussels sprouts and things like that. We talked about this earlier, high fiber, sauna, things like that. So basic things you can do. Healing your gut. So many people have leaky gut, and it's actually a problem. We're learning, of course, much more about the oral and the gut microbiome. And then bioidentical hormone replacement if it's indicated. And there are all sorts of experts on this. Now, you can do this for 6 months to optimize these things, and many people will respond without doing anything further. But beyond that, what we like to do then is zero in on, okay, what are the critical things? Does someone have a specific tick-borne illness such as Borrelia, Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, other things like that? Do they have oral pathogens? If they have specific toxins, you can target those. What about epigenetics? And this is getting better and better. There are now groups that will do epigenetics. IGL happens to be one of them. There's another one in North Carolina called True Diagnostic. We're going to see more and more on epigenetics because it gives us a look at what's actually going on right now with specific genes. And then mitochondrial support can be helpful for many people. Do they have evidence of autoimmunity? If so, things like low-dose naltrexone can actually be very helpful. So that's the next 6 months. Now, the third piece is troubleshooting. Where do we stand? Has the person improved? Have they not improved? Are there things that we've missed? I often, when people tell me, well, I'm not getting better, I say, okay, let's go through the basics. What do what's your ketone level? And they say, oh, I don't check that. I'm not doing that part. Well, okay, then you're not going to have optimal outcomes. So let's do some troubleshooting and look at what actually could be preventing people from getting better. How long have you been on the protocol? As I said, if you've been on it for 1 week, don't expect too much. We've seen people start to improve after a few days, but it's typically 3 to 6 months after you do the various pieces. And what we see is this comes in a couple of phases. The first thing that people notice is the decline is slowing. The second thing is that the decline has stopped. And then the third thing is that there are some minor improvements. And people will often, the spouse will often email me and say, oh my gosh, as for example, one person said, we got into the car today and I said, oh, I forgot how to get where we're going. And the patient said, oh yeah, you turn left, right, 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 left, left, right. And he said, she hasn't been able to do that in 5 years. So you start noticing small and then larger improvements. Could you have missed something that's not Alzheimer's? That's a critical piece. Of course, what we've developed here works very well for people who are in pre-Alzheimer's or in early Alzheimer's. For people in Lewy body, it actually works quite well as well. But if you have frontotemporal dementia, we don't have data to say that this works for that. We just don't know yet. Have the suboptimal lab values been optimized? If you haven't optimized them, then you can't expect to be improved. Have you achieved mild ketosis? Are you on a good fats-based diet? How advanced was the process? No surprise, if you came in with a MoCA of 0, it's going to be much harder to get improvement than if you came in with a MoCA of 25. Most common cause is lack of compliance. We usually tell people, please work with a health coach. They can help you to continue to do the right things. The second most common cause of failure is that someone has severe toxicity, and it takes years to get these toxins out. And then we have the too important syndrome, where people say, I'm too busy, I'll do a little here, and then I'm gonna go to Europe for 3 months, and then I'll do a little for a week or two. Then I'm gonna run to a meeting in Washington, DC, then I'll do a little bit. That never works. This is something where you have to devote some time and effort. You are literally changing a neurochemistry that has been damaging you for years. So you have to address these things. Nocturnal oximetry, if you're dropping into the 80s every night, that is likely to be a contributor. How's your oral health? If you've got all sorts of pathogens, then that can be a problem. And the good news is there's something you can do about it. Do you need a consultant, someone who deals with these biotoxins? That's a whole field unto itself. Do you have undiagnosed sleep apnea or upper airway resistance syndrome or other reasons to drop your oxygenation? Are you doing regular brain training? If so, are you getting better? That's a good sign. If you're doing regular training and it's showing you that you're better, that's a great sign. And on the other hand, if it's just continuing to go down, let's find out why. Many people try to get away with doing nothing except a few supplements. That never works. Then the key, by the way, this is just what Dean Ornish reported 30 years ago in cardiovascular disease. As he pointed out, the patients have to get over a certain threshold. And then once they get there, they actually begin to get better with their cardiovascular status. Same thing with the brain. You have to get past, you have to get on the good side of that signaling. If not, you want to keep on tweaking. Do you have continued exposure? This is another relatively common one. People are living in homes where they have a lot of toxin exposure, and that makes it tough. are the major underlying causes? Have you addressed them? Let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay. And then as a scientist, I have to say, I was surprised. I always kind of poo-pooed the idea that anything was important about purpose, joy, stress reduction. I always thought, we just get the neurochemistry right, everything will take care of itself. But I have to say the data have proven me wrong, that it is really important. People having purpose, joy, stress reduction, behavior, all these things are really helpful in their lives. And even things like transcendental meditation have been shown to improve blood pressure, improve things like neuroplasticity. I can't deny it. The data speak for themselves. And so one of the earliest patients came in and had very clear addressable things, very low estradiol, vitamin D, pregnenolone, all this stuff, very high homocysteine. We treated these things. She came back 3 months later and actually was like a completely different person. She actually slapped me on the leg and said, "Hey, doc, I'm better." And like, wow. One of the most common things people will say is, wow, they are more engaged, more interactive when they do these things right. However, after she continued, she decided she just didn't want to do these things. And so no surprise, she started quitting the various things and started getting worse. And her family brought her back to me. And I said, look, if she doesn't want to do the things, then we can't make her better if she doesn't want to be better. So she actually went to a health coach, and the health coach said she does not want to live. And what had happened, which they hadn't told me about, what had happened is that her granddaughter, who was the love of her life, the light of her life, had gone away to school. And so she had what really drove her life was her interactions with her granddaughter. And when her granddaughter left and really didn't have a lot of interaction with her, she simply did not want to do these things. So you've got to kind of figure out, how can we get people to do the right things, to have that purpose and joy in life? And so we've learned a lot of lessons from the patients, and here are a few of them. So here's a woman, 54-year-old, a 4-4 progressive decline, treated with the protocol. She went from the 35th percentile on her cognitive testing to the 98th percentile. She did absolutely great. After 7 years, however, she began to note some decline again. So I said, look, you've got to have further evaluation. Let's find out what's causing this. She turned out to have very high markers for mycotoxins and for tick-borne. These go up with mycotoxins, they go up with tick-borne illnesses, and they also go up with herpes family viruses. So she was checked for all those three. She turned out to have babesia, which is a cousin of malaria. This turned out to be from a tick bite she had had 10 years earlier. And she was treated for the Lyme part of the tick, but unfortunately, more than 50% of the people who develop the Lyme also will develop other pathogens. And in her case, it was babesia, which is actually the most common co-infection with Lyme. She was treated with that. She improved once again. She's been stable for 3 years. She remains on the protocol. Here's another person, 78 years old, cognitive decline for 4 years, and she had a MoCA score of 0. So this is very, very, this is end stage Alzheimer's disease. And she had a massive exposure to mycotoxins. One of the things we found is she initially improved, but then she lost weight. When you go on a ketogenic diet, people tend to lose weight. And so we're getting this to give you the ketones, but also to make you insulin sensitive. And the fundamental nature of this problem is a network insufficiency. So you have to be careful. You're taking someone who has an insufficiency and now you're making them fast. So you have to make sure they have enough support, enough energetic support for their brain. So she was liberalized, she improved once again, she sustained her improvement. So there are features associated with positive outcomes, people that you get MoCA scores of 18 or above. We've seen MoCA of 18 go to 30. We've never seen anyone go from 0 to 30. We've seen them go from 0 to 9. My goal during my lifetime is to see someone go from 0 to 30. It's never been done. If you're early on, if you have simply SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, virtually 100% of these people do absolutely great if they do the right things. If you have clearly addressable metabolic abnormalities, if we find them, great. If you work with a health coach and a supportive family, positive attitude and compliance, really helpful. Continue tweaking, just continue to optimize things. You can continue to do this for your whole life. This helps. Getting into some ketosis. And we typically say, just get exogenous ketones at the beginning. That's fine, because you've got to bridge that energy gap. Over time, we want to slowly work you into endogenous ketosis, where you're making the ketones yourself, because that has some advantages. But to begin with, just get on them because it helps your brain. If you have a lack of severe toxins, if you've had symptoms for fewer than 5 years, improvement in metabolic markers, all these. Now, the bad side of things, poor compliance, lack of interest, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. If you have severe toxicity and continued exposure, it's really tough to make people better. People with a MoCA score of less than 10, many years of decline, lack of support from family or health coach. We hear this all the time. You know, the family said, well, I called up another doctor who said, I don't believe in this. Okay, you know, as one guy said to me, a physician who came to see me at UCLA, and I was going through all these things, and he said, look, you know, this isn't a cure for Alzheimer's. I said, no, each one of these things is part of your overall system. And by the way, he did extremely well, and his gray matter volume increased, and he improved in his multiple metabolic parameters. But after about 30 minutes of his telling me it wasn't this and it wasn't that, I said, look, give me 6 months. If I can't make you better in 6 months, then go somewhere else. And he said, there is no other place. I said, well, okay, give me 6 months to see if I can help. And he's done very, very well. And then failure to identify key contributors. If you can't find what's causing the problem, it's hard to fix it. However, we have had some surprising responses. As I mentioned, we've had people with MoCA scores of 0 improve. They do things like, you know, they start to dress themselves again, and they start to speak again, and things like that. But again, the earlier we can catch, the better off. We've published multiple papers on this, and we posted last year. This is all publicly available, freely available, and also published 3 books. The End of Alzheimer's is now available in 32 languages. The End of Alzheimer's program came out in 2020. And then in 2021, we published The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. Just wonderful stories from 7 different people who wrote their own first-person stories about what it felt like to be told by their physician that nothing was going to be helpful, and then for them to actually get better. So I just want to finish up then by talking about the trial that we did, and we're now starting a larger randomized controlled trial, but of course you have to start somewhere. And we tried a trial back in 2011. We were turned down for that trial because it's a multiple variable trial. Of course, this is a multivariable disease. And we flipped the script here. For all previous trials, what people had tried to do is tell ahead of time, okay, we're going to treat people who come in with X. It's going to be this drug or that drug or what have you. That's not the way we want to address this. We want to ask what's causing the problem and then treat those things. So this is registered. You can look at clinicaltrials.gov. It's registered, was denied in 2011 and 2018. And then we finally got it approved in 2019, completed at end of 2020, posted it in 2021. It's a small proof of concept trial with 25 patients who had MCI or early dementia. So none of these people were SCI. These were all that 3rd and 4th stage. They had MoCA scores of 19 and above. It compared personalized precision medicine protocol. So we're identifying all the things that we talked about here and then addressing those things 9 months. And we want to look at these root causes. Then we want to measure what actually happened. So we do MoCA scores 0, 3, 6, and 9 months. We also use an online test because it's more sensitive. This is called CNS vital signs. We also use what's called AQ21. This is where the partner will say how much of a problem is there, and what your score is goes along with whether you have MCI or dementia. And then we use something called the AQ20, which is a change score. This is now the partner goes back after 9 months and say, did they get better? Did they get worse? So we want to have both objective and subjective scores of how they did. And we particularly wanted this because in trials in the past, you could have a minimal effect objectively, but subjectively, the families noticed nothing. We can't tell any difference. We wanted to see, could we measure difference but did it make a difference in real life? Could the families see improvement? And then we looked at the MRI at the beginning and the end with volumetrics. So we're measuring hippocampal volume, gray matter volume, things like this. So you can see here, these people continue to improve. And I should point out the pandemic hit right here between the 6 months and 9 months here, because we were doing this in late 2019 into 2020. So you can see here a few people down here who kind of dropped off, unfortunately. Nonetheless, we continue to see improvement over time in these people. We also saw improvements in their metabolic status. They improved their inflammatory characteristics. They improved their hemoglobin A1C status. They improved their dyslipidemia. They improved their methylation, and they improved their vitamin Ds. So to summarize what happened to these people, 76% actually improved, and not just slowing their decline, they actually improved their scores, which is unheard of. Their neurocognitive index improved. That's from the CNS vital signs, 84% of them. We had people going from 19 on their MOCAs all the way to perfect 30s. Cognitive subtests improved. They improved their verbal memories, their executive function, their psychomotor speed, their cognitive flexibility, and others. Their partners noticed that they improved. That was another good thing. Their brain training scores improved in all of them. And then importantly, their MRIs. Not sure what that was, but in any case, their gray matter volume improved. And if you have MCI or Alzheimer's, your gray matter volume shrinks each year. And in fact, just normal aging, it shrinks slightly each year. These people who actually had MCI or Alzheimer's actually grew their gray matter volume. And in their hippocampal volume, although it did decline slightly, it declined less even than normal controls, than historic normals. So implications for this: cognitive decline is reversible for most people. If you do the right things, if you measure the right things, you should be able to get some reversal. For those where they failed this, and we did have a few people, but it was pretty clear. So for example, Dr. Hathaway, and I was very honored to do this with three absolutely outstanding functional medicine physicians, Dr. Ann Hathaway, Dr. Kat Toops, and Dr. Deborah Gordon. And one of Dr. Hathaway's patients, we found massive mycotoxins in her home. She said, I don't want to remediate, I don't want to do anything, and I'm going to keep living in it. So no surprise, she was one of the few who actually did not get better. Feasibility, this is one of the issues. Just as Dr. Zook said earlier, how do we make it so it's simple? That's what we're working on, but we need to improve the feasibility. We get that. Right now, though, we've trained over 2,000 physicians who are able to do this protocol. It's a little bit, I'd say that this protocol is more like surgery than medicine. You kind of have to learn a way to do something. It's not just writing a prescription. So the results of the study, the positive results, provided strong support for another trial, which is the one that we're just getting started. And then the idea is, can we take this and adapt it to other neurodegenerative diseases? And we've started a project to do just that. What about Lewy body? And actually, Lewy body patients, as I mentioned, tend to respond well to this approach. But what about others? What about macular degeneration? What about frontotemporal dementia? What about ALS? The hypothesis is that all of these represent mismatches between supply and demand in their various neural subnetworks, so that we're now going to go after each of these by improving the supply, reducing the demand, take the same approach we've taken to Alzheimer's. But combining the results of the trial with the fact that we have a long window, if we can get everyone to come on to active prevention at the age of 45 or to as early as reversal as possible, we should really be able to make this problem optional instead of unavoidable. This is why we recommend for anyone, if this is in your family, please get on active prevention. And look, I understand, I'm just turning 70, so I understand fully that we're not going to get perfection by the time I'm gone. But one of my favorite quotes is actually from a rabbi who said, "You're not expected to complete your life's work during your lifetime, neither are you excused from it." And so the hope is we'll all continue to work together to make this better and better so that we truly can make Alzheimer's a rare disease. So let me end there. I'll stop the share and we can pick up on questions whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bredesen. And now we'll have our 20-minute break. However, during the break, you'll hear that funny noise again during one of the films that we show. It came from there. So we'll show a film during this break, but feel free to go out and see the coffee service and stretch your legs or whatever. But we'll now have a 20-minute break. Please remember to fill out these cards and submit your questions. Just hold them up on the end of the rows, and the ushers will come and pick them up and deliver them to our questioners at the front desk. After the break is over, which will be about 20 minutes, we'll begin the question and answers live. Your questions, through our questioners at the table, will ask them on your behalf live with Dr. Bredesen. So enjoy the 20-minute break, and maybe we could roll that film strip.
How many of us would like to avoid Alzheimer's disease? Yeah. Me too. Yeah. And how many know they're fasting insulin? Okay. How many know their ApoE genotype? HHV6A status? Okay. Nocturnal oximetry? These underutilized tests are just some of the many critical tests to determine whether you are at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and more importantly, why you may be at risk. But what is Alzheimer's disease? Why is it so common? And why has there been such uniform failure in the quest for a cure? Let's look under the hood. At the heart of Alzheimer's disease is a master switch called APP, for amyloid precursor protein. APP is a sensor for numerous factors such as hormones and nutrients and inflammation and growth factors. When these are optimal, APP is cleaved, it's cut by molecular scissors at a single site to produce two peptides or protein fragments, SAPP alpha and alpha CTF. These mediate growth and maintenance. Literally, you are putting your resources into memory formation and maintenance. On the other hand, in the presence of pathogens, things like viruses, bacteria, fungi, or toxins, or reduced support, APP is cut at 3 sites to produce 4 different fragments: SAPP beta, A beta, which is the one we classically associate with Alzheimer's disease, but as you can see, it's a much larger story. JCASP and C31. These mediate retraction and protection. Your brain is now in protection mode, pulling back rather than in growth mode. Therefore, what we call Alzheimer's disease is actually a protective response to numerous different pathogens. It's essentially a scorched earth retreat. And the amyloid that we have vilified is not the cause of the disease after all, but actually a protective part of the immune system. So, what flips this switch, this master switch? Well, the bad news is that there are dozens and dozens of different things that can contribute, and that most patients have more than 10 contributors, such as infections, such as P. gingivalis from our dentition, herpes simplex from our lips, toxins such as metals like mercury, or organic toxins like toluene, or biotoxins, which are toxins made by some mold species, or reduced support from growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or reduced hormones, estradiol, testosterone, thyroid hormone, or reduced nutrients such as vitamin D or omega-3 fats, or leakiness of your gut lining, or metabolic abnormalities such as diabetes and prediabetes. All of these factors acting on our genetic backgrounds. Now, the good news is that there are dozens, not thousands. And the great news is that virtually every single one of these is treatable. So, given all these factors, what would the perfect Alzheimer's drug look like? Well, the perfect Alzheimer's drug would have to do all of these things. And that is a tall order for a drug. And so, as you can see, the perfect treatment for Alzheimer's disease may not be a single drug working alone, but instead may be a personalized precision program. And therefore, rather than looking for the elusive silver bullet, we have been developing silver buckshot. And we have used this silver buckshot in a way never done before, asking for each person, what are all the contributors to his or her cognitive decline, and targeting each one. What is the fasting insulin? What is the pathogen exposure? What is the toxin exposure? And over 100 different variables. And we have documented and published for the first time reversal of cognitive decline in over 100 patients with Alzheimer's or pre-Alzheimer's. So here are a couple of examples. Marcy had low hormones, low nutrients, and a chronic undiagnosed infection. And you can see how beautifully she did, not only with her cognitive scoring, but also with her hippocampal volume. And the hippocampus is a critical region of the brain for memory, and it is one that is heavily impacted in Alzheimer's disease. Here is Edward, and Edward did beautifully. Edward had chronic inflammation, low methylation, had chronic inflammation, had low pregnenolone, and also had low vitamin D. And not only did he do very well with his cognitive improvement, he has sustained this now for 6 years, which has been unheard of in Alzheimer's disease. These are just two of the many examples of reversal of cognitive decline, examples in which families got their loved ones back. Now, we are in the midst of the first clinical trial in history in which we target and identify all of the contributors to cognitive decline for each person. In contrast, all previous clinical trials have predetermined a treatment and therefore not treated what is actually causing the cognitive decline. This new approach should revolutionize the way we evaluate and treat all neurodegenerative diseases. Our generation will be the last generation to fear Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease will go the way of past scourges such as leprosy and polio. Our sons and daughters will live in a world in which Alzheimer's is much less common and much more treatable. For the first time ever, we have the ability to make that happen. Thank you.
Well, I took part in genetic testing when I was turning 50. And that's when I learned I carried 2 copies of the ApoE4 allele. And my story's a little different than everyone else's because I didn't have the luxury of the blueprint of Dr. Bredesen's protocol. This was back nine years ago. So when I realized I was at high risk for Alzheimer's, I took a hard look at my cognition, and I realized that I had been struggling for quite a while. I had started getting lost in very familiar places. I had incidents where I ran into people that I should have known and I didn't know them. I struggled with simple paperwork, with balancing the checkbook, with calculating a tip. My personality was changing. I was very frustrated. I've been a lifelong reader and I was struggling to read. It wasn't enjoyable anymore because I couldn't remember what I had just read. So I decided to do some cognitive testing. I did, and I learned I was in the mid 30th percentile for my age group. I was only 50 years old and I just still couldn't believe it. So I repeated the cognitive testing and I got the same score. That's when everything really came home to me. I looked into Alzheimer's to try to figure out what I could do. At this point, I was very naive. I thought I could take a pill or something. I went to the Alzheimer's Association website and they said it was preventable, incurable, untreatable, and progressive. And most people are dead within 10 years. So I was already very frightened. And at that point, I was truly terrified. Luckily, 23andMe provided forums where I could engage with other ApoE4 carriers, and I did. And we created a community and a family, and we very quickly turned to the science. And we began reading every journal article we could find, every medical paper we could find, every specialist we could talk to try to figure out what we could do to mitigate the symptoms of our high-risk allele. And as I began learning about all of these strategies, I began applying them. So I dramatically changed my diet. I changed the way I exercised. When I learned I had 2 copies of ApoE4, I realized I was very fragile and I had been leading a very stressful, high-paced lifestyle. And I learned I couldn't do that anymore. So I began to prioritize my sleep. I began to meditate. I did daily brain training, and I did something sort of stupid there. If I didn't beat my score from the day before, I stuck with it until I did, which is something I don't recommend because it's very stressful. I also started taking targeted supplements. I started following various biomarkers as I learned about their relevance to cognitive decline. Started tracking my fasting glucose, my fasting insulin, my HbA1c, my vitamin D, my homocysteine, and so on. I also paid attention to toxins in my environment. I made sure the water that I drank was clean, the air that I breathed was clean. Even the toiletries and cosmetics I put in my skin, I made sure they were as toxin-free as possible. I used the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database to identify the cleanest products. And I did this protocol that I put together. I call it the kitchen sink approach. And after a year, I repeated cognitive testing, and I was in the mid 90th percentile for my age group.
My best news is I've been on Recode for 5 years. In the book, I talk about it 4 years, but I wrote the book a year ago.
Right.
So I've been following Recode for 5 years, and it works wonderful as long as I follow it. As Dr. Bredesen just said, I actively, as a retired nurse researcher, actively sought out research. I enrolled in a national trial. I was told I'd have advanced Alzheimer's in 10 to 15 years because I was positive for beta amyloid plaques. As a retired researcher, I devised a method so I could tell whether I was in the intervention or control, and if I was in the intervention, as I hoped, whether or not it worked. And that was before and after each IV infusion, I would subtract 7 from 100. And at that time, I could not do it accurately, but I also timed myself. And starting with my second IV infusion, I not only got worse on my score and my timing of subtracting 7 from 100, but I got irritable, I had trouble sleeping, I got anxious. And in the meantime, my husband heard about Dr. Bredesen on a talk show. I emailed him, asked if I could be part of his research. And he said no, since I didn't live in California. I'm on the East Coast. But he graciously offered to help me. And I started the protocol. His first publication talking about in 2014, talking about 10 people in which 9 of them had reversed their Alzheimer's. He described the lifestyle changes. I started those. And then I had the cognoscopy. For those of you who, first of all, I encourage everyone to get a cognoscopy. It's a diagnostic that covers all the risk factors. You have a lot of blood drawn.
Yeah.
I was discouraged when I got my results because I was less than optimal or abnormal in almost every one except Lyme disease. I also discovered I was positive for one of the APOE4 or the Alzheimer's gene. And then I also was tested for my toxicity problems. And I love being on the program. I've changed my lifestyle. I've learned how to handle stress. I sleep more. I like doing Brain HQ each day. My life is great, the best it's ever been.
I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have my life were it not for Dale and the protocol.
Turn off the volume, please.
So I'm extremely grateful.
So there's
And yeah, 10
threatening
years
weather
ago,
outside.
I was the first
and I
fruit
think
fly,
we
I
need to
guess, or
take
maybe
cover.
not the fruit fly, but anyway, I was
So,
at really a low point.
Paul, can you tell
my
us,
life
do we need to
because I-
take cover in here, or is there a better place? We'll be okay in here? So if someone wants to go downstairs for safety, there's a basement down below here, if you feel better doing that. Otherwise, I think we'll turn this back on, but just so you know, you have the option to go downstairs where there's maybe a little bit better protection. This theater has existed for umpteen years and survived lots of weather events. But just so you know that there is, I believe it's a tornado, either a threat or warning. So just so you know that.
I just felt that I didn't want to repeat what I had seen.
So it's reported ping pong ball-sized hail on its way in. I was just outside, so I would stay away from any glass areas. We should be fine in here, but if you are worried about it, we can go to the basement.
So nobody's leaving. So let's just continue with the program that we have.
Through Dr. Bredesen from another arrangement, and she suggested that I fly out from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I thought, well, what have I got to lose? You know, I was really so desperate, and so I did, and we spent, a few hours, Dr. Bredesen, I think. He was explaining a lot of things, which at that stage went right over my head, but I did have a little piece of paper and a notebook, and I was writing everything down, and I still have that little piece of paper, by the way, and it was all, try this supplement, try that supplement, do this, and I realized from that conversation.
So the weather is a thunderstorm warning and not a tornado warning, just so you know. But there's expecting some large hail. So those of us in the ramp should be okay. That's why I parked in the ramp. I knew we were between thunderstorms. I was hoping it was going to come at 8 o'clock tonight, like they said.
Okay, so you're probably safe in here, is what they've said. You're probably safe in here. Anything develops, we'll let you know and give you an update. But otherwise, enjoy the show.
Okay, let's.
Really been doing all the wrong things, not sleeping, not eating properly, high stress. just everything on the list, practically exposure to mold, exposure to other toxic elements. So I said to Dr. Bredesen that day, I'll do whatever you say. You want me to eat dirt? I'll eat dirt because I'm going to do this. And I really think that's the answer. I think it's compliance. I think this you hit the nail on the head when you said it's a hard work that we've all done, and it is hard work. It's the hardest work you'll ever do, and you've got to be committed, and you've got to be willing to do the work, or you will not get a good result. So.
Yeah. And before you came out, what had your doctor told you?
Well, my doctor told me that I was on the same path that my mother was. I was forgetting the most simple things. I was mixing up the names of my pets. I was actually calling my grandchildren the wrong names. I was getting lost on very familiar places when I would drive. I would reach for the light switch on the wrong wall. I mean, I literally was going down that slippery slope very, very fast. And I knew it. And it's that gripping terror. If any of other people have felt this, you think, oh my God, I know what's happening to me. And it's like it takes your breath away and you don't know what to do. And the more you don't know what to do and the more stressful and tense you get, the less you can think straight. So I was terrified and I knew where I was going. And you know, there are other issues that being in a doctor's office, they just basically tell you, we'll come back in 6 months. And I guess then you get to go on Aricept or one of the other drugs. And I did not want to do that. I wanted an alternative. So that's what really compelled me to get myself out to Dr. Bredesen's office.
And then when you got started, I remember you actually called us about 3 months in and telling us that things were getting much better. But I know a couple times you were forced to stop because either you had a viral infection or you were traveling or you ran out of some things. And tell us a little bit about what happened when you stopped.
Well, my job at the time, and my husband for many years, was international work, international development. And I'd go overseas to a lot of conflict countries, very stressful environment. And a couple of times I ran out of my supplements because I stayed longer than I anticipated, or I had jet lag from long flights. And I had a regression. At those times, I started having foggy thinking again. After getting clarity, I started to kind of go backwards. And I really quickly realized that I needed to stay on the supplements. And also I needed to make sure that I got good rest. And that was something.
Okay, so we're getting ready for our questions and answers. Are we prepared for that? I can hear hailstones on the roof, so we're in a thunderstorm right now, Dr. Bredesen, just so you know.
Okay.
And Chris and Kim, you want to begin?
The first is a couple of questions for, will the recording of the session be available?
Yes.
Okay, and can we send out slides? Will that be possible also?
And pardon me?
Can we send out slides?
Yeah, the recording will be available by Monday, and you can probably get it through our website.
And everything Dr. Bredesen presented will be on that recording.
Okay, in the recording will be the slides. They will show in the recording.
And one more question that's not specifically for Dr. Bredesen. Is there a plan to have recode and or pre-code trained practitioners in our area, with this protocol?
Well, because of the CME certified requirements, we're not allowed to promote any particular program. You can call it whatever you want, but what Dr. Bredesen described, personalized approach to that, is actually, was the question, will it be available in St. Cloud?
Yeah, will it be available in St. Cloud?
So we're kind of doing that. We're not fully up to the speed of what Dr. Bredesen is describing, but we're pretty well on our way there. We're because our office space is donated by Centricare, there's something called the Stark Law, where you're not allowed to feather your own bed as a medical provider. So for us to order all these tests would be a Stark Law violation. So we recommend to the primary care clinicians to do the test, and then we get the results back and work that way. Now, sometimes the primary care clinician chooses not to do the test because we're trying to get the word out about the importance of this. But we're already doing that to some degree.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to try to stick with some general questions. You all had some very specific questions, which we might get to, but we're going to try to stick with the general questions. So could you talk about, very apropos to our recently increasing COVID numbers again, long COVID and associated cognitive impairment with that?
Yeah, it's a great point. As you know, many people, and the numbers vary. Some studies have claimed it's 30% or 40%. Some say it's higher. But as you know, many people do get the long COVID. And one of the most common symptoms of long COVID is brain fog. And we don't know yet. You go back 100 years to the flu epidemic, when one of the problems that came later, of course, was this so-called post-encephalitic Parkinson's, which was not directly related to the flu epidemic, but probably to another virus. But in any case, there's a big concern. Will we see an increase in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? And there have already been 3 cases in people with COVID reported of Parkinson's. But we don't know yet. And this is why we recommend that anybody who has had COVID, please get a cognoscopy. Please get on long-term prevention. And it's simple to get a cognoscopy. It has 3 things. So you want to get some blood tests that are critical, as we talked about earlier. You want to get an online cognitive assessment to see where you stand. And then you want, if you have symptoms already, you want to have an MRI with volumetrics. But if you don't have symptoms, the MRI is optional. So I completely agree with you. This issue of long COVID is increasingly a concern. And this is why we recommend please get evaluated and get on active prevention if you've had COVID. And I had COVID myself a year ago, despite full vaccination. I got Delta after traveling to UCLA. And so, I didn't happen to have brain fog with it, but it's a concern. And so getting on active prevention is a really good idea. And that means optimizing those various parameters we talked about.
If I may add, in our evaluations of the clinic, of patients we see in our clinic, we take very careful note of each and every immunization and whether or not they've had COVID and what month and what year that was. Because I think going forward, it's going to be very important in medical history, especially in terms of cognitive ability.
Please give concrete examples of how to help someone get past the denial barrier.
Say again?
Please give concrete examples on how to help someone get past the denial of having a problem barrier.
Dr. Bredesen, do you have any tips?
Well, it's a great point, and we do run into people. And I mentioned earlier someone who just didn't want to get better, but we do have people who just say, I don't want to do this, and I deny I have a problem. A common one I hear is, my spouse isn't perfect either. So my argument is, then we should both get evaluated, not neither one of you. So to some extent, this is a question for a psychiatrist rather than a neurologist. But I think that what we've found again and again is that if people come in together to say, okay, well, let's go let's go the husband and wife, or let's go the partners, and let's get checked out together. If you have a health coach that hey, let's work with this health coach, meet this person. They're really pleasant. They're great to work with. Even if you're saying, I don't have problems, let's even take this sharper, because we have people who are, quote, normal, who now do better than normal when they do this. So let's all stay sharp to 100. You can also say, look, you're fine, but let's protect you for the rest of your life. And so isn't it a good idea to have some protection against potential of future cognitive decline? So I think, getting a positive attitude, getting other people to do it with you, getting involved with a health coach that you enjoy working with, these are all things that can be very helpful.
We noticed in our clients that it seems like anosognosia, the inability to see that you have a problem, is really hard to get past. So if the person living with the symptoms in their brain, they're dead set that they have no problems, it's very difficult to make progress. We have a very willing caregiver or two with them in the interview, but this person is, we call it the folded arms approach to their care. Well, you know you're just not going to get through that. So if their brain dysfunction includes anosognosia, the inability to see that you have a problem, I don't know how you deal with that, but even beyond that, we see a lot of opportunity for counseling in couples, some of whom have been married 50 and 55 and 60 years. Everything worked for 55 years, and now there's a tremor in the force, and it's starting to break down. We've not found resources, and so we're in the process of writing a grant to create our own senior dementia-associated counseling, not only for the person living with dementia, but even more so for family and partners dealing with these issues. It's incredible to see people who've been married 50 and 60 years and how they support each other, even dealing with us, but it's causing incredible stress. The usual scenario for us, the person living with dementia is fine and happy, but the partner is just having a very hard time, very, very stressed. So it's a huge gap in our system that we are hoping to figure out a way to get out of. But the new, very particular issues between couples and families, dementia, we feel, is a family system condition. And the counseling, we think, will help. We don't think they need eternal counseling, but 4 or 5 visits and then maybe annual tune-ups would be nice. Anyway, we're working on that.
If I could just add one thing to the earlier question, getting a few extra blood tests is not going to get great results. So I encourage people, if you don't take training, go work with someone who's done this successfully, because the data ultimately, getting people better, that means everything, and it's not easy to start with. And don't start with someone who's got a very low MoCA score. Start with someone who has MCI or even SCI, and show yourself that you can do it, what it takes, show them that you can do it, and then you can build up to working with people who are more and more impaired. But the idea of just, let's order a couple extra blood tests, that hasn't worked so far. So please be careful, and don't get disappointed or frustrated if the first time you try this and you don't get the best outcomes, because it takes some knowledge, it takes some experience to get the best outcomes.
So there's a number of questions regarding testing. One question just came in on the chat that says, are the labs that we do at my annual physical enough to identify this? You've talked about very specific labs that you do. We also, of course, always have the perpetual question of how are we going to pay for this, and do insurance companies pay for this? And then even beyond that is the follow-up. Are there labs that we can do to follow progression? So I know that's a huge question, but if you could just take a stab at it, thank you.
Yeah, it's several different questions. So I mean, when you follow up, you kind of want to see how you're doing with the pathophysiology. And there are now becoming tests, things like phospho-tau and epigenetic tests, where you can follow your brain aging and things like that. But for the initial thing, you want something completely different, which is what are the things driving the decline? And the annual physical, unfortunately, does not include all of them. It'll include some. Some people include in their physicals HSCRP. Most will have a lipid panel. Those are all helpful. Some will have homocysteine, not too many. Some will have fasting insulin, not too many. These are all crucial. Virtually none of them will have anything on toxins. So, to some extent, you can do these as you're evaluating. If you find out that it looks like we're going to go in this direction here, we do need to look further into toxins. So, so the bottom line is, yes, these things are helpful. Now, you brought up, are they reimbursed? So in some plans they are. So some of these can be reimbursed, some of them aren't. We hope ultimately that there will simply be a panel that you can get that will be completely reimbursed. That's the way things are headed. But we also recognize that when Dean Ornish started his approach to cardiovascular disease about 30 years ago, it took him 16 years to get Medicare to approve this approach for treatment. And when he complained to a local politician, he said, hey, it took 16 years to get this approved. The guy said, only 16 years? How come so short? That's amazing. So the wheels of progress turn slowly, and we just have to keep at this, and we're working to get this approved by Medicare so that ultimately it'll be easier. And we've set up the beginning of a network of clinics around the country that will offer this. The first one happens to be in Florida, and so they have Medicare so that it can help support this. So we'll get there, but I think that it's always a concern. How do you start when these tests aren't being done routinely?
Dr. Bredesen, could you say a word on Dr. Perlmutter's book on uric acid and how that may come back and be important?
Yeah, and there, so Rick Johnson, who's a professor at University of Colorado, who has done a lot of work on fructose and its metabolism and the fact that it raises uric acid and how that is a very common problem. And so actually, David Perlmutter, Rick Johnson, and I are just finishing an article originally written by Rick about the potential contribution of fructose to cognitive decline. And it is, I have to say, it's impressive that there are so many kind of signature symptoms and changes. So if you look at the equation I showed earlier, you look at the various pieces of it, things like, anything that causes inflammation, anything that causes insulin resistance. Well, it turns out that fructose, and of course we've all been exposed to high fructose corn syrup over the years, turns out to induce a number of these things. It does induce some inflammation. It does induce some insulin resistance. It does induce some metabolic changes, and it does increase your uric acid. So that is his hypothesis, and it dovetails very nicely with what I showed you today. It fits very much with the overall network insufficiency that our research has suggested. So I think it goes beyond just uric acid. There are many kind of monoetiological theories of Alzheimer's, and as I said earlier, none of them has really led to successful treatment. It's part of a network of change. But I do agree with him that an important part of that network will be that metabolic pathway that begins with fructose and impacts your uric acid.
Thank you.
Another one, we've got a number of the same question. Can Alzheimer's be diagnosed definitively before death?
Yes, and that used to be, that was a common one that was said 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and more, that you couldn't get a definitive diagnosis. What's happened is there are better and better tests now. So PET scan, when you say definitive, if you want to be 100%, then yes, an autopsy or a brain biopsy. But you can get a very, very good likely diagnosis with a PET scan. So you can look, for example, there is a classical pattern of decreased glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal region and specific regions such as posterior cingulate in people who have Alzheimer's or pre-Alzheimer's. There are also now, of course, amyloid scans. In some cases, also tau scans. There's also spinal fluid. You can look at specific ratios, the so-called A-beta tau index, which helps to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. And then now there are some blood tests. There's so-called precivity, and there's one now coming out with phospho-tau as well. So there are very good tests now. You don't need to wait for an autopsy to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we have to kind of get away from the idea of Alzheimer's. When we just say someone has Alzheimer's disease, it's like waiting to diagnose diabetes until you have diabetic ketoacidosis. We want to know when someone has pre-diabetes and even before that when they have insulin resistance. Similarly, we want to know when someone is at risk for Alzheimer's or when they have SCI. Having Alzheimer's, that is a very, very late stage of the pathophysiological process.
Great, thank you. I just had a quick one, hopefully. Could you talk about hearing loss as a risk factor?
Yeah, so again, you can go back to the equation I showed. Anything that is less stimulating, anything that is removing support, anything that is removing trophic support is going to be a concern and can potentially increase your risk. And that includes hearing loss. It includes vision loss. A common effect of the disease is loss of sense of smell, and that's a common one that precedes Parkinson's diagnosis as well. So hearing loss is absolutely a contributor. Is it a causal contributor? Probably. People believe that improving hearing probably is going to give you reducing your risk, but that hasn't been proven yet. So yes, it's a good idea to get your hearing checked, and it's a good idea to make sure that if your hearing is impaired, that you address that.
We also had a couple of questions on leaky gut. What exactly does that mean, and how do you evaluate for it?
It's a great point. And when I was training in medical school back in the 70s, there was no such thing as leaky gut. People didn't really know about it and didn't talk about it. But there's been some beautiful work by Professor Fasano of Harvard and numerous others over the last 15 years or so, looking at the leaking of the gut as well as the gut microbiome, and these are closely related entities. So you have, as you know, a normal gut microbiome with specific bacteria, specific ratios, et cetera, and this has a lot to do with things like autoimmune disease, Parkinson's disease, cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's disease, all of those things. Now, for many of us, we develop what's called a leaky gut. What that means is your gut is normally meant to allow specific nutrients and, in fact, to enhance the ability for the nutrients to come across and into your bloodstream so that you can take advantage of them. Unfortunately, for many of us, because of poor diets or ongoing inflammation, various toxins, various pathogens we have can get into our gut, for example, end up having a leaky gut. So it allows things like bacteria and fragments, so-called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, which is a fragment of bacterial wall, basically, to get across into the blood. Now, your blood recognizes these things as foreign. They're not the normal nutrients that are supposed to be coming across. So you then develop a secondary inflammation because you're responding to this. And it is one of the risk factors for cognitive decline, as well as other things. It's turning up in arthritides, various arthritides and things like that, autoimmune diseases, things like that. So it is absolutely a problem. And the good news is you can heal it. You can check your gut microbiome. You can also heal it. There are numerous things that people do, even things as simple as bone broth that has a lot of L-glutamine in it, can be very helpful to improve your gut. There are other things you can take as well, things like slippery elm, and there are all sorts of things that can improve your gut and improve your microbiome. Prebiotics and probiotics, also helpful. So again, if we're going to get optimal health, and that includes our cognition, we want to make sure that we don't have leaky gut, and if we do, to make sure to heal it.
I want to remind people that any questions that we don't get to, if you put your name, this is mostly for the people online, but also in here, if you put your name and phone number, if we don't get to it, I will make best effort to try and call you in the next few weeks and review the question results with you.
You're going to be very busy in the next few weeks. I have a question we've talked a lot about very specific things and individuals. I am a public health professional and a family doctor. I want to talk about how our community, our social determinants of health, trauma, community violence, how does all of that relate to dementia?
It's a great point. And there's been work on things like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. These are, no question, increased risk for cognitive change. And so, yes, all of these things. And of course, there's a lot of work on direct head trauma. But more and more, it's clear that mental health trauma is also a risk factor. And of course, we see the same sorts of health disparities that are seen with COVID. You can see, of course, with cognitive decline as well, with differences in what's been available. And unfortunately, the program we've been talking about today is difficult to get availability. We'd like to make it available to everyone, to do more and more. But one of the biggest problems, just since you brought up public health, I think that's a really good point. The arguably the most important progress in 20th century medicine was made by the combination of public health changes and the development of antibiotics, where we could take on these simple diseases. It was a cleaner place that people would live. There were fewer infections, fewer early deaths, things like that. The 21st century now, we need to do the same sort of thing, to combine the public health measures with appropriate protocols now, precision medicine protocols, to reduce now complex chronic illnesses instead of these simple illnesses of the 20th century. But that is going to require changes in our food, changes in the way we practice medicine. These are big changes that need to be enacted. There's a wonderful book by Professor Robert Lustig that I recommend to everyone. It's called Metabolical. Just came out several months ago. And he talks about, big food, big pharma, big medicine. And, as long as you are, as long as you're chowing down on things that are bad processed food that's full of toxins and has got all sorts of high fructose corn syrup and stuff like that, it's going to be tough to lower your risk for cognitive decline. The good news is it's pretty simple concept, that you need to eat better, sleep better, have less stress, and do some exercise, and basically function as a normal human being, and do, people talk about ancestral health. Okay, that's a reasonable approach. The way that we were evolutionarily designed to function was not sitting on a couch with a remote in our hand and eating corn chips and drinking soft drinks. That's just not, we were not meant evolutionarily to do that. We were meant to get out, to be running around, to get good sleep at night, these sorts of things. So those are some basic public health things that can and should be enacted. The problem, as you know, you're now speaking, as they say, truth to power, as Al Gore says. So you're now talking about groups that are making billions upon billions of dollars by making our health worse. Unfortunately, and so this is going to be a fight over the next upcoming years to improve these things, and I think Metabolical does a great job of summarizing some of the ongoing issues. And here, just for a comparison, as I told you earlier, our trial it took us from 2011 to 2019 just to get it approved. That was despite publishing improved people along the way and finally getting this thing approved. We've just, by the way, gotten it accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Great, happy about that. In contrast, the drug aducanumab, which was developed by Biogen spent about $28 billion developing that. And as I showed at the beginning, it does not make people better or even stop the decline, but it did in one trial at one dose, it did slow the decline by 22%. And so when you've got, you're working against groups that are spending billions and billions and billions of dollars, and as was pointed out by one doctor, all of the positive op-eds that were written about this were written by people who were paid by the company to write good things about the drug. So I think we have to get to a point of looking at proof, looking at data, and I completely agree that public health is going to play a huge role in 21st century complex chronic illness and what to do about it.
Dr. Bredesen, do you think Medicare will ever pay adequately for the kind of service you're providing, your full individualized protocol?
Yes, I do. It's not going to be today. It's probably not going to be while I'm alive, but I think ultimately what happens, here's the problem, or here's the reason. When you have a single person with Alzheimer's, on average, that person will end up spending about $350,000 by the time of death. And I know you as a DCAN are much more familiar with these numbers than I am. But there's a huge expense, and of course, a lot of it is for nursing homes that can be $100,000 a year, $80,000, $120,000. It can be crazy. One person emailed me and said that that my numbers were too small, and in her mother, they spent over $1 million by the time her mother passed away. Now, it was because she was in a nursing home for 13 years. That's why they spent so much in that particular case. But it is much, much less expensive to do the right things for prevention and early reversal so that you never get to the point of being in a nursing home. So we're interested ultimately in having dementia insurance. There is no such thing in the US today, but this is exactly the sort of thing that we need, a more active form of insurance so that you prevent the cognitive decline, stay sharp, as it were. And so I think that's when Medicare will ultimately get in and say, yes, we realize that it actually is going to help people to do things much earlier and pay much less to get a much better outcome.
We've actually had major health insurers come to our strategic planning meetings. We had 4 large community-based strategic planning meetings when we were looking at the gaps in our dementia care system. And they were interested in saving money, but I think they're mostly interested in saving money this quarter.
Yeah, and then that's exactly the problem.
And not the long term. We're thinking if we delayed, for instance, somebody who would, if everything stayed the same, would get dementia starting at age 64. If you could do, starting at age 30 or 40 or whenever it's appropriate, to do the prevention, the early recognition, and the precision medicine, you delay their onset of symptoms 10 or 15 years. It would be incredibly valuable, and I'm sure accountants could figure out the cost savings of that, but that's not in what they pay for. It's not on the list of the things they pay for.
Right.
So
So we do have one insuring group in Texas that is now going to offer this protocol. So I think the tide is just beginning to turn, and I think we're going to see more like this, where people will offer prevention. And I do think we have to quit thinking of this as an old age disease. When I was at Duke, people often referred to it as old timers disease instead of Alzheimer's. As you know, many patients will call it that. And we didn't know back then in the 70s that in fact the pathophysiological changes begin about 20 years before, at least 20 years. That's what we can pick up with PET scans and with spinal fluid studies. It may be before that. So the disease that we used to think of as a disease of your 60s, 70s, and 80s is really a disease of your 40s, 50s, and 60s, and in fact is starting in many people even before that. So even children getting on all this high fructose corn syrup, they're already starting to increase their risk. Childhood obesity, childhood type 2 diabetes, which again, things that we used to not deal much with, very common now. So all of these things are concerns, and I think that this is something we have to think of as a whole community or whole family issue rather than just an old person's issue.
we've sort of vilified fructose, but could you reassure us that if you eat an apple, you're not going to get an overdose of fructose?
So glad you mentioned that. When you eat fruit, first of all, we want to have relatively low glycemic index fruit. But when you eat a fruit like apple, as you said, what happens is that you get a lot of fiber, and the fiber improves your glycemic load. So you're not hurting yourself by having an apple. You're not hurting yourself by having some strawberries and things like that. But you are hurting yourself by having a soda or by having anything that's going to give you those simple carbs and bump up your glucose, giving you a high glycemic index and especially glycemic load.
Which includes, if you slug down 10 ounces of orange juice really fast, you're getting a huge fructose load if you don't include the fiber.
Exactly right. That's a concern. And I grew up in Florida thinking that the best thing you can do to start a day is to have a bunch of orange juice, and it turned out that was not the case. Not good for your glucose.
But the section of the orange, if you eat the whole sections, it would be okay.
Much better. And
We
you
also
can, by
have a
the way,
number
you
of
can measure
questions
these
on
things
the
now.
intermittent fasting and how that impacts dementia and some of the other factors that we talked about today. So could you talk a little bit more about the specifics on what you found on intermittent fasting?
Great point. Fasting is actually one of the more important things. Now, let's start with the good things, and then we'll talk about the nuance here. So the good things about fasting, it allows you time. We typically recommend at night a 12 to 16 hour fast, depending on whether you're ApoE4 negative, 12 to 14 hours, or ApoE4 positive, 14 to 16 hours fast. And this does a number of things. It improves your glycemic control. It improves your stress levels. It improves your blood pressure, by the way. Fasting actually helps your blood pressure. And it also helps you to clean out your brain, the so-called glymphatic system that helps to get rid of some of the damaged proteins, oxidatively damaged lipids and proteins and glycated products and things like that. Helpful for all of those things. And so that's why, this is recommended. Now, there are all sorts of different fasts. As one person said, you shouldn't call it intermittent fasting because none of us is eating 24/7. Of course, we fast intermittently. It's just a question of when and how long. Some people do a whole day. Dr. Mark Madsen of the NIH showed some nice data years ago on rodents showing that if you just feed them every other day, they do better with their cognition. Here's the problem, though. You have to be careful. For human beings who are developing cognitive decline, as I mentioned earlier, it is fundamentally a network insufficiency. So you have to be very careful about taking away sustenance. So this is why at the beginning we say, yes, the fasting is good. It helps to make you insulin sensitive, but you don't want to be starving yourself so that you're now actually getting worse. And I gave the example of the woman with the MOCA score of 0. She got worse with her fasting. And when we liberalized things, she did better. So we got to look at the two sides here. At the beginning, take some ketones, get your ketone level up exogenously. It's better than nothing. And it helps to bridge that gap. And the beautiful work from Professor Stephen Kinane, as I mentioned earlier, who's from Canada, showing that when you use these ketones, you can improve MCI in many people. However, we then also want you to not be eating all the time so that you can help become insulin sensitive, because that's the other part of the equation. And it is a critical part to get your brain, your neurons. When we used to grow neurons in a petri dish in the lab, we would also always have to include a little bit of insulin because that is a supportive factor for the neurons. So that's so the point here is that having this intermittent fasting, very helpful for a number of things, starting with insulin sensitivity. But be careful, especially if you have a low BMI, if you are frail, if you are thin, be careful about this. And you probably know about fasting mimicking diet. This is some beautiful work from Dr. Walter Longo. And again, be careful. He recommends if you're 65 or over, be very careful about what you're going to be doing with this because you want to make sure you're not frail. So I actually feel more comfortable when someone has a high BMI, 26 or 28 or 30, then the fasting does better. They've got enough adipose tissue to make those ketones to do fine. They often will have high levels of insulin. I worry about the people who have BMIs of 17 and 18 and who are frail. Get those ketones on board first, keep your nutrition good, and be careful about long-term fasts.
Dr. Bredesen, do you see a lot of clients who have lost weight as a result of their dementia symptoms?
It's a common thing. And so, yeah, two things happen. One is just going on the treatment will often lose people weight. In fact, it was one of the signs that things were going to go well with their cognition was that they would come in and say, oh yeah, I lost 10 pounds or 20 pounds. We knew they were becoming insulin sensitive and they were going to do well. And by the way, continuous glucose monitoring, CGM, easy to get now, common, incredibly helpful to see both when you have the peaks and when you have the valleys. If you're dropping too low, which happens a lot at night with a high carb diet, a typical American diet, that's also not good for your brain. Now, separately from that, before you ever start treatment, you're absolutely right that statistically, there is an increased risk for cognitive decline with people who are overweight. But as you now become demented, they typically lose weight. They have poorer nutrition, poorer mitochondrial function, et cetera. And they often actually become, ultimately, they become frail.
So we have a bind when we're seeing people who've lost 40 pounds. Their BMI is quite not as low as you were talking, but well below 30. And
Yeah.
they're on a high-potency lipid-soluble statin, and their last LDL cholesterol was 45.
And that is a risk for cognitive decline. And so, you need that, and it's been sad for me to see that so many practicing physicians don't think that there's a lower limit. They'll just drive it down. They'd prefer it to be zero. And in fact, there is an optimal, and it's in the middle. And one of the biochemists who studies this carefully says his healthiest patients, have total cholesterols between 200 and 250. We think of that in general as needing a statin. So first of all, we recommend to people, don't just look at the total cholesterol. That's a very poor indicator. Look at the LDL particle number, or the small dense LDL, or the triglyceride to HDL ratio, or the oxidized LDL. Those are the good predictive markers. Do a calcium scan, see if you have any coronary artery disease, and be very careful about statins. One of the exciting things we found, both in the trial and in the anecdotes before the trial, is that many people, when they are simply doing the right things, getting on the right diet, doing the right things with their sleep, etc., come off their statins. They no longer need them. They come off their antihypertensive. There's a way to save some money. Come off those, and then they will come off anti-diabetes drugs as well. They no longer need metformin, for example. So they don't have these chronic problems because these were being driven by the things they were doing wrong ahead of time. So I recognize there are medical legal issues with stopping statins. So you have to be very, very careful and often work with the internist or cardiologist. But many people will find that they simply don't need them. And you're absolutely right. If someone's walking around with these very, very low numbers, that is a concern. And as you know, it's associated with atrophy in the brain.
Yeah, I just want to comment for the audience on how much I appreciate those comments about managing the chronic disease and the memory will get better. I think we focus so much on the supplement and how do I get these ketones and that I think we forget all of the important work that needs to happen prior and in the early stages. Thank you. My next question is about why dementia appears to be more prevalent in women than men.
It's a very good question, and the answer is not known, but there are several findings of relevance. One of them is that if you want to induce someone to have dementia, you want to pull away all the trophic factors very quickly. And so Mayo Clinic did a study a number of years ago showing that women who are 40 years of age or younger who had lost their support, typically from an oophorectomy, for whatever reason, if they didn't have hormone replacement therapy, they doubled their risk for Alzheimer's. Even though the Alzheimer's wasn't diagnosed until years and years later, they doubled their risk. So as you know, when a woman goes through menopause, and of course it varies from woman to woman, but in general, they have a more rapid decline in hormonal support than men do when they go through andropause. They have a more gentle loss of support, although of course they both lose support over time. And study out of Stanford, for example, showed that yes, having these replaced actually is helpful. Of course, the WHI changed everything when it came out and said, no, this is actually a bad thing. So many people stopped, and of course, some people developed Alzheimer's disease in association with stopping their hormone therapy. So there are many experts now working on bioidentical hormone replacement, the right things in the right way, with the right method, the right delivery at the right time. And I think that there's much more promise, especially when that's used on the backbone of an overall protocol to do the best things. So I think that part of the reason that it's more common in women is because of this change in trophic response that occurs more rapidly in women than men. But there have been other things suggested, epigenetic changes, for example, suggested, and the bottom line is no one knows exactly why this is, but you're absolutely right. It's common, as Maria Shriver has pointed out, about about 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women, and about 60% of the caregivers are women. So it truly is a woman-centric disease, unfortunately. Now, ALS and Parkinson's, both more common than in men than in women. As I said before, there are these different neural subnetworks, and each one has its own set of requirements. Each one has its own demands as well. And then you're right, the one associated with Alzheimer's disease, more commonly affected in women than men.
Okay, we also had a number of questions on MoCA. Specifically, what's the normal range? How are the scores determined? What exactly do they measure? And are there other neurocognitive tests that are sometime being used with your protocol?
Yes, we also use, as I mentioned, CNS vital signs because it's more sensitive. It's a little more detailed than MoCA. But the reason we use both is because the two of them together, MoCA is good when you're a little further along. It was developed for people with MCI. CNS vital signs is actually tougher, more stringent, so it's good for people who are actually in the earlier stages. Together, they give you a larger dynamic range. And there are other things like SLUMS, which is the St. Louis version, very similar to MoCA. And there's another one, for example, mini mental status, MMSE. There's another one called SAGE. These are all different ones. SAGE and MMSE tend to be for people who are farther along still, more demented. So they're not terribly sensitive. So the MoCA, you can look at online easily. It's a series of questions, straightforward. You can do it in about 12 minutes. The good thing about MoCA is that it tests different areas of the brain. And so, for example, it will look at your executive function. It will look at your parietal function. It will look at your memory. It will look at your verbal abilities. It will look at your ability to repeat sentences. It will look at your orientation, things like, what day of the week and things like that. Where are you? So it tests a lot of things that we associate with, with cognition and with cognitive change. So I find it a very helpful and simple way to get at it. Now, the scores you asked about, formally, normal is 26 to 30. Very few people in this room who are at their best cognitively are going to score 26. People even 27 and 28 can still have some MCI. Again, you have to remember, this is about where you've been, not just where you are. Are you changing over time? So we have people who are brilliant, and by the time they get to 27 or 28, they're already very far along in MCI. We have other people where even at their best, maybe they're going to score a 26 or 27. So of course, you have to look at where you've been, not just where you are. But formally, what's considered normal is 26 to 30. 19 to 25 is considered MCI, but there's an overlap. From 19 to 22 can be dementia or can be mild cognitive impairment, depending on activities of daily living. So that you can, so if you got 19, you can go either way. You can also look at the AQ21, which is, as I mentioned, what the partner scores, and that will tell you if your score is very high, it's more likely to be dementia. What AQ21 has set out is 4 to 14 is MCI, and above 14 is typically dementia. So those are the sorts of scores. The average for all people with Alzheimer's is 16.2. So that'll tell you, when you're in the mid-teens, you have significant Alzheimer's disease likely. But as I said earlier, we've had a few people, even with MoCA scores of 0, improve, start to dress themselves again and things like that. But they are not coming back to 30 from 0.
So maybe we'll do a couple more questions.
We had several questions about alcohol specifically and maybe some other drug use, but you had spoken about resveratrol and a glass of wine. Can you talk about the difference between making it worse and making it better?
Yeah, resveratrol. So there's not enough resveratrol in wine to help you. It's minimal. But it's extracted from that, and it can be helpful. So the way that works is you have an enzyme that impacts your transcription, this SIRT1, And this thing actually impacts by acetylating, basically. It is an acetylator and deacetylator of proteins. This thing, when it's synthesized, is in an auto-inhibitory structure. So this thing sits there and it's not active. What activates it is when you are low on energy. This thing is, so it's NAD plus that activates this because you're low on energy. Resveratrol relieves that activation, so it makes it be active even in the absence of the NAD, which is why people take it. Now, alcohol itself, as you know, it damages cognition. Long-term alcohol use is long-term damaging to cognition. You have to be careful not only about the direct effects of the alcohol, but also about the impacts on things like thiamine. Few weeks of heavy drinking, you really can crater your thiamine, and that can be a big problem. So people should be on some thiamine to make sure they have enough. It is huge for memory and why people get Wernicke syndrome and Korsakoff syndrome. Alcohol is the top. Now, what we recommend for people is, look, if you're on prevention or if you're doing very well and you want to have an occasional, small amount of alcohol, like a drink, and it doesn't impact your cognition, fine. But be very careful when you're getting to the point that it's damaging your cognition, that's really hurting you. And of course, the same thing, the drugs, there's a lot of work now on what are the drugs that increase risk for cognitive decline. And they are things like benzodiazepines and things like anticholinergics, anything that has an anticholinergic effect, including things like some of the antihistamines, increases risk for cognitive decline. So we want to make sure you've got enough cholinergic tone, not be dampening that down.
A couple specific questions. If someone wants to be part of your study, what should they do?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we're doing a nonprofit study, very much like before. This is a randomized controlled trial. It'll be at 6 sites. So unfortunately, you need to live close to one of the 6 sites. And those are Miami, Cleveland, Southern Oregon, Ashland, Sacramento, San Rafael, and Pleasanton in California. So there are 3 sites in California and 3 sites outside California. There may be one additional site at some point, we don't know yet. We'll see, but you'd have to live within an hour of those to get to the doctor to be a part of that trial.
One other quick specific one. Is there any value for a patient with moderate cognitive impairment to continue on Namenda and Aricept after taking it for 5 years?
Yes, that's a really good point. The last thing you want to do is cold turkey Aricept. That has been damaging for so many people. And Dr. Wes Ashford from Stanford had pointed this out a number of years ago, that if you suddenly stop Aricept, often people will have a rapid decline and they never get back to where they were. So please, we recommend for everyone, please do not discontinue Aricept, especially Aricept. Now, for both of these, if you're going to come off them, please do it very, very slowly. And what we usually tell people, if you start on the protocol, just keep the medicines, whatever you were on, just stay on them. After a year, if you're doing really well and you've really improved, then try over a year, very, very slowly, removing the Aricept and Namenda. But here's why you have to be careful. Aricept is an inhibitor of cholinesterase. So the thing that's breaking down your acetylcholine, you're inhibiting that. Your body recognizes that and it says, oh, you're trying to inhibit one of my enzymes, I'm going to make more. So you now have more. You respond by having more cholinesterase than before. Now you suddenly cold turkey this, you're really in bad shape. So if you're going to do it, please do it very, very carefully and cautiously with your practitioner, and make sure that you don't see an accelerated decline when you stop it.
Let's try one more question.
Okay, I have a question about comorbidity with psychiatric disorders. You had talked about people showing up with depression early on, a lot of people with anxiety with some early memory. as well as other psychiatric disorders. Can you just briefly talk about that?
This is such a good point, because, it used to be when Freud was training back in the 1880s, it was about neuropsychiatry. These later split, and the idea was, well, the psychiatric diagnosis, you don't see anything wrong anatomically with the brain. Well, of course, it's turned out that psychiatry and neurology really are part of the same field. This is about brain and how your brain functions. And so there are two things here. One is that there is overlap. So yes, for example, we now know that one of the contributors to depression is systemic inflammation. Well, that's an important contributor to cognitive decline as well. So these are closely related. Similarly, there was a study several years ago looking at ADD. People who develop ADD as adults, do they have increased risk for cognitive decline? And the answer was yes, they do have increased risk for cognitive decline if you developed ADD as an adult, not as a child. So there are many of these relations, many overlaps. When we talk about that balance, it's very interesting. That balance that I showed you earlier in APP, that balance is toward the Alzheimer's side in someone who has ADHD, even though when they're young, they're not having any degeneration. The balance is on the other side, onto more plasticity, larger brains, more BDNF in people who have autism, interestingly. They actually have lower levels of Alzheimer-related peptides than normals. So these things are all interrelated. You mentioned depression, as we talked about earlier. Yes, depression always makes me concerned about toxin exposure because it's the common time you see depression as an early feature, a presenting feature of cognitive decline. Often tells you, please be on the lookout for toxin exposure and please address those. So yeah, you're right. For all of these different reasons, there are close relationships between neurological illnesses and psychiatric illnesses. Again, whether you're talking about ADD, whether you're talking about depression, whether you're talking about any of these. And of course, schizophrenia is another one that people have begun to look at these same sorts of functional medicine types of protocols for schizophrenia.
Well, Dr. Bredesen, thank you so much. We really appreciate your expert comments and the quality information. You're a fabulous teacher. We really appreciate it. And thank you again so much for donating your time today to our conference.
Thanks very much.
We will now get ready for having our lunch. I believe our box lunches are outside there. And so please stick around and talk amongst yourselves. We don't want this information to just evaporate on your way home. So feel free to mill about and talk to each other. We want to, and we have evaluation forms. We want you to fill those out. We have some other information that they can hand to you. We really appreciate you filling out the evaluation. We'd like to have a conference in the fall similar to this, maybe focus more on services. And we would have this one in the spring similar to what we had here today. So we'd like to do that. We have several people to thank. Steve Brunsberg from St. Paul Neighborhood Network, all the people from St. Cloud State who helped us with the technicalities and so forth. We thank our panelists, Dr. Jaden and Dr. Tackle, for asking those questions. Did they do a great job? More than anything, we want to reduce the stigma of cognitive dysfunction. We want it to be a part of daily life. We want it to be something that we just deal with as a community. And a lot of our clients that we see have withdrawn socially because they're afraid to be out in public and not remember people's names. So think of gentle ways you can help somebody through that. They're coming up to you. You can see the panic in their face. They can't remember your name. Oh, yeah, I'm Pat. You know, you remember our kids played baseball together or whatever. Help them out. So keeping people engaged in society will keep their brains active. We see the social withdrawal as very painful to our clients, and COVID did not help that one bit. And so we're trying to get them back. And, you know, when they've been out of circulation for these 2 years, it is hard to get back when you're 84 years old. And a lot of your friends have moved away and so forth. We'd like to thank Bob Hughes of KNSI Radio, who did our voiceovers. We'd like to thank the people here at the Paramount Center for the Arts, right here in downtown St. Cloud, Minnesota. We thank all the folks at Whitney who gave us our start. Dr. Bredesen, of course, we mentioned. The Board on Aging gave us a tremendous dementia grant such that we could afford our executive director and our care navigator. I'd like to thank our executive director, Patrick O'Rourke, who's really into all this production stuff, and he had a lot to do with this. And Tammy Kolbinger, our care navigator, educator. She worked and worked and worked and worked and did so much to make this go. Again, we really appreciate your comments. In any evaluation, if you feel so inclined, just call the office, the DRC office. We do evaluations. We're not just a referral center. We actually evaluate. And since I'm in primary care, I look at the whole person. Analyzing the complex medical care that Dr. Jaden mentioned is very important. If you do dementia care without looking at all that, you're really missing the boat. So we try to include that whole thing.